It was September. Two people sat on the roof of a building and looked at the city, which was in full view, a boy and a girl. Yasya looked at Vijin, resting her cheek on her palm, asking about his dream. The boy held ice cream in his hand. He licked it. His dream was to build the most beautiful house. Looking into the distance, the girl thought the dream was similar to the dream of her father. Looking up from the ice cream, Vijin beamed. He envied the girl and wanted to be like her father. A man approached them. He heard their conversation. He was interested in what was wrong with this place. It was the girl's father, Hunter. He smiled, looked at the children. They screamed. He sat down in the middle with them, his legs hanging down. He arrived in a car that was parked behind. I looked down. He smiled sadly, and turning to the boy, he replied that he envied him because he had not dreamed for a long time. Embarrassed, Hunter boasted that he had once designed a 30-story building, and the boy approached him. Hunching over, he admitted that it wasn't as fun as he'd imagined. In the place where they live, it is impossible to build anything else, only one square. Leaning towards Vijin, Hunter admitted that he had not been abroad, but was sure that everything was possible there. The girl touched the backpack. There was a smile on her face. She turned to her father so as not to clutter the child's head. The man and girl stood up. They said goodbye to the boy and were about to leave. Hunter turned to Vijin so that he would not lose his dream even after time. The boy was embarrassed. He promised that he would build something beautiful. And after these words, he turned to the girl, combed his head with his hand, and announced that he would marry her. The words flowed like a river. If he did not forget his dream, then Hunter would give him a gift. A grown man, 42 years old, looks at the plan in his hands. This is Vijin, looking up from the sheet, shouting to the side that the tile laying was finished. He thought that if he left everything like this, then they would have a problem later. A man approached him. The head of the company, Kai Kiers, arrived to them. He specialized in architectural design in Spain. Vijin bowed his head in greeting, but he passed by, throwing a note in his direction about checking things out. The guy looked over his shoulder at the manager and thought that the meeting with the customer had gone poorly. The boss found something to be biased about. He touched the tiles and confidently declared that they were dirty. Kai was interested in the deadlines. He hoped that everything would be completed on time. He pointed to the hydrant. He didn't do that in the plan. It's striking. Vijin smiled. For safety reasons, they decided that he would be hidden like this. Kai poked his finger into the guy's chest, asking him if he knew anything about design. The chief accepted his position, but it still needs to be done as planned. Vigin's face darkened. After saying that he was just a builder and obeyed orders, he turned pale. Hanging his head, he remembered various situations with subordinates where there was no money for the education of their children. The hand clenched with great force the fist that contained the construction plan. Completion of construction, the man met the manager and assured that everything would be fine. The fire hydrant was hidden in the slab. Everything was done as planned. The fire engulfed the building. People were running around and did not understand what to do. They ran in search of a hydrant, but never found it. The girl was holding a handkerchief near her mouth. She was choking and asking for help. The two were in the office, sitting on the sofa. They were sad, not a single smile on their faces. The man closed his eyes. He was clutching his elbow. He was nervous. The client was angry. Vijin, and it was he, confirmed his words. He warned that in a dangerous situation, the necessary things should be open. The man grinned, tucking his chin in his hand, wondering what the guy was complaining about. Vijin jumped up from his seat. He screamed. He did not agree with this. The man smiled. He joked, but the guy roared even more. People's lives are not a joke. Looking at another man nearby, how he takes out some documents from a folder. Vijin made excuses, saying that on the last day the boss controlled everything. They pushed a sheet of paper towards him. This is a plan, and asked him to look at the date of this plan. His face darkened. Something was bothering him. Something was incomprehensible to him. He suspected something. Having looked directly, the man offered to pay a reasonable price and pretend that it was the boss who made the wrong drawing. But Vijin doubted. He didn't want to agree if he didn't agree. He wanted to hear what would happen. Sitting on a chair, the man smiled, folding his hands on his knees, because the money for the construction had not yet been paid. Sweat rolled down Vijin's forehead. He couldn't afford not to pay them. Smiling, the man pretended that it had nothing to do with it and that he had done something wrong. Hearing that the father of the man sitting in front was the president of the company, he completely dropped. The man straightened his tie, looked to the side. A smile played on his face. He wanted to seem modest. It won't be difficult for him to bury Wijin's company. He jumped up but was stopped by another guy. Taking a glass of coffee and grinning into it, he annoyed the guy by saying that he hangs out with uneducated people, which is why he's still at a construction site. Wijin was angry. He screamed. The man calmed him down, urging him to calm down, since aggression will not solve anything. The calming man said that he had better agree to the proposal. Looking at him, his face turned black. Wijin reached his hand to his mouth. A young man was sitting on a bench next to a large banner advertising a girl, glowing and cheerful. Looking with a heavy, tired look, Wijin said the girl's name, Yasya. Throwing his head back so that he hit the back of his head, the hero closed his eye. There was a bright light, and through this light a bus drove forward, spreading this light to both sides. The young man entered the open doors of the bus and climbed the steps. He sat down on an empty seat in the cabin. The bag strap rolled off his shoulder. Resting his head on his hand, he was lost in his thoughts that he wanted to become a designer and build beautiful houses. He looked out the window, dismissing his dream. He could barely make ends meet. A voice called out to him. The voice asked if he had forgotten about his dream. He saw Hunter. He was sitting and smiling, closing his eyes, but through the cracks he was spying on the guy. Turning to him, he clenches his teeth, not understanding how this could happen. But Hunter is already going down the stairs from the bus. The guy only sees the back. Wijin jumps out after his uncle, tries to catch up with him, calls out to him. He looks around and realizes that they came out in the very place where he dreamed as a boy. The guy sees a man with gray hair going up the stairs. Wijin is immersed in his thoughts. He decided to move on. He will do everything for this. He was able to catch up with the man, approached a familiar house, but stood and watched as the old man opened the door. It was a long time ago. He sincerely did not understand why this man came here. Distracted by his thoughts, Wijin missed the moment when Hunter disappeared somewhere. He grabbed the door, intending to enter because he had come so far, and now there was no point in turning back. The guy persuaded himself. He just wants to refresh his memories. He needs it. Opening the door and going inside, Wijin thought that this was an ordinary house that stood alone. He turned on the light on his phone and continued to tell himself about this house, the designer rooms. Looking into the room, shining a flashlight from the phone, an incredible place for a house that was built a long time ago. The phone fell from his hands with a thud on the floor, the sound resounding in the silence of the house. He looked straight, could only utter one word, and breathed out this word incredibly. He was surprised that everything was the same as before. All the furniture, all the objects, everything was the same as before when he was little. Lowering his head down, he saw the imprint of a shoe moving away from it. He exclaimed. Hearing the voice, Wijin sharply turned his head towards where the voice came from. Hunter stood in front of him, shining, smiling, and praised the guy for not giving up his dream. It was as if he had not changed during this time. He smiled, holding out his hand to Wijin, and the portal glowed behind him. The guy opened his mouth. He didn't know how to react, didn't understand what was happening at all, couldn't utter a word. Hunter was floating. He beckoned the man to come to him, pointing at something with his hand, saying that it would allow him to see his dream. The guy leaned forward. He didn't understand what his uncle wanted and meant. Grabbing his head sharply with his hand, Wijin screamed. His eyes were closed, and his face was distorted with a grimace of pain. Sweat was dripping down his face. He didn't understand where he was. He looked lost. Looking down at his hands, he was still in the dark about where he ended up. Looking carefully around, he saw cabinets and uniforms. He was surprised, since he was in the company. Sweat was dripping down. His teeth were clenched. His eyes were wide open. He was in shock and didn't understand what was happening anyway. The guy woke up, rubbed his eyes, saw Wijin and called him by his last name, adding the word Sergeant. He looked at the fighter incomprehensibly. He was asked to change his clothes. Turning his head, he saw something that made him scream. Wijin returned that day when his service came to an end. He screamed. His mouth opened. Now he was already out of the gate, in uniform, the last day of his service. He stood confused. Taking off his cap, he turned back, wondering, because if he had gone back 10 years ago, his life would have gone completely differently. Looking at the phone in his hand, he could not save it. He regretted it. Wijin went into the store. He wanted to buy a new phone. He was given a choice. The seller looked at him, probed him, considered him a weakling. The guy asked for the latest model of phone. 3 phones from different companies were laid out in front of him. The seller insisted on a certain model because he wanted to get a profit. After looking, Wijin asked for some more models or to repair his own. but the seller began to dissuade us from repairs and assured us of the need to buy a new one. The seller smiled and calculated its cost, but the guy said goodbye and opened the exit door. The seller shouted in his back that they wouldn't buy anything else at that price anywhere else. Looking at the phone, it started working. The soldier was surprised. He thought it was a joke. Eugene is sitting on the bus. He reached into his backpack. He began to look for something inside. Finding his headphones, he prepared to listen to music. It had been 10 years since he had listened to music. Leaning against the window, he plunged into the world of news, music, and rode the bus. Entering the room, taking off his uniform as he went, he looked around. He fell onto the bed, spreading his arms to the sides. He was resting. He had not been at home for so long, but how good he felt. He succumbed to memories. The guy could explain the reasons for his failure in the past. He felt sorry for his mother, his academic education, so he chose to go to the architect's office instead of design. Putting his hand under his head, he decided that everything would be different. He was sure of it. His mother came into the house. She put her hand to her chest and exclaimed that her son had returned. The hero's eyes sparkled with tears. He looked at his mother. Everything that was happening seemed like a dream to him. Putting his hand to his head, he saluted his mother and shouted loudly that he had returned home. The service was over. She praised him. After that, he squeezed her tightly in his arms. She was surprised at such impulses from him. Hugging his mother with both hands, he promised himself that he would be a good son in this life. The hero was watching TV and cheering for the team. 2 weeks later, his mother came out to him, surprised by his screams. While eating dumplings, he listened to his mother. When he heard the word study, he was very surprised. She confirmed her words and advised me to buy some clothes. Smiling at his mother, he agreed to go out to get some air when he noticed the woman's fear that he was sitting at home. Putting his fork on the plate, the guy convinced him that he had already rested enough. Looking at the ticket in his hand, he thought about the need to wait, otherwise it would be revealed. Sitting on a chair, his hand in his pocket, he looked at the phone, did not know how and then how to do it. Grinning, the guy thought that this was a picture and it was ridiculous. His eyes looked straight. Bowing his head, resting his hand, he did not understand what was wonderful at this time. He had to return to 16. Turning on the camera on his phone, he smiled and said that he came from 2030. But noticing the girls who paid attention to him, he became embarrassed and pretended that he was not filming himself. Cupping his face in his hand, Vijin lamented that time was passing slowly. Rising sharply from the chair, putting his hands on the table, the guy realized that he would not waste such a chance. He would fix everything. The girls looked at each other. Vijin ran. He was sweating, but he continued to move forward. There was determination in his eyes to fix everything. Out of breath, he stopped, put his hands on his knees and tried to catch his breath. Straightening up, he looked at the old building without taking his eyes off it. In front of him, there was a building, and he saw that from his time a house that was being sold for a lot of money. The guy thought that if they had not sold this house as collateral, their living conditions would have been much better. 2 years later, his mother sells the house last time, but this time he will not allow his mother to do it. Vijin looked at the phone in his hand. The job advertisement will be posted tomorrow. He will earn some money tomorrow. Took his eyes off the phone and looked somewhere to the side. People were sitting in the room waiting for something. One man stood with his chin in his hand. He shouted at the men. They did not provide labor. He wondered what they were doing. Standing in front of the men, he began shouting about the deadlines and how difficult it would be for them to complete the construction. Hearing that they had already called the HR department, he raised his hands and began to shake them. Turning away from them, he looked halfway at them. He would decide something. They thanked him. He only needs 3 people, only 3 who can do the interior work. Looking in the other direction, he gave the order to start from Sector B, where there was a cafe. The subordinate hesitated. He was afraid that the design would have to be ready in a few days. Looking out the window, he offers to pay more, but in exchange, he wants to see a beautiful design. Vijin was going up the stairs. The worker was going down, muttering about his problem of finding the right person. The guy heard him. He smiled at his thoughts, thinking that he knew all this and that it was expected. Getting up, he opened the door, walked in and said hello. Continuing to smile, he stood waiting. The man was distracted from his work. He looked at the guy and asked him what he needed here. Vijin approached him. He replied that if it was for work, then not to him, but to the labor bureau. The young man showed a sheet of paper, a job advertisement. The smile did not leave his face. Pointing to himself, the guy said that they needed someone who would draw pictures and he had experience. Looking at it, he became curious about how he saw this advertisement in 2 hours. The man smiled. He found out how old Vijin was and thought that he was joking with him. But when I heard that the guy worked under Kerr Wise, he leaned forward. Vijin offered to check him. He needed a day. Even without payment, they would check him. The boss remembered Kerr. He is an outstanding designer, good work. He himself was with him once. The young man didn't lie. He really worked with him for 5 years in a previous life and learned a lot. Naturally, there is no way to check the words, since he is abroad now. The man looked at the guy. What was he offering? Vijin suggested doing his job well, that's obvious. They shook hands, believing each other's words. One needed people, the other was not trying to deceive. I was distracted by the phone and asked the young man to wait for a few minutes. The boss laughed. This was an important call. Opening the door, he offered the guy a choice of coffee or tea. He chose coffee. They walked to the work table. The boss did not delay and immediately offered to get to work since they were in a hurry with the change. Peter Wong was surprised when the guy called him by name and looked at him for a long time. Vijin smiled, raised his hand behind his head. He couldn't restrain himself and ended up calling him manager. But the man had already begun to think when he managed to tell him his full name. A little later, Peter tried to contact Cyrus, but he was away, so he couldn't. He thought about the guy, how he looked like he and the man were friends. He had nothing to lose anyway. Vijin sat at his desk and wondered if he would be able to show off his skill. Turning around, he asked someone about the sketches, the plan to check with a click of the mouse. The question was directed to the manager, who was hovering over the guy. He had several drawings, but they were ordinary. A drop of sweat ran down the man's cheek. He turned away, throwing it away as usual. He was not going to make excuses. Having unfolded the body, Vijin directly asked if he could make a model. Peter was surprised that he volunteered to make the model himself. There will be no payment for modeling, but this was not a problem. There will still be daily payments. Raising his head, the man began to talk about tomorrow morning. Vijin interrupted, saying that he needed less time. He knew what he was saying. Peter's face changed. He was amazed at such efficiency. Staring at his work computer, in front of him was a modeling program. The guy was excited. The boss turned to him, asking whether everything was in order and whether there would be any problems. But Vijin remained calm. He had not used this program for a long time, but now he would remember it. Peter leaned his body towards him, folded his hands on his chest. It was not clear to him what he had been using for a long time, but the young man interrupted him and began to work. His hand is on the computer mouse. He is focused and knows what he is doing. His fingers press, barely touching the key, typing and selecting options. Time passed and the model of the building was ready. It showed off on the screen. Peter raised his eyebrows, opened his eyes, raised his hand to his mouth. He was shocked. Smiling, clarifying the working details with the man, he put on his jacket and headed for the exit. Peter followed Vijin with his eyes and thought that his skills as a carpenter would come in handy. The guy smiled, was pleased. He was needed and he would help. He was called as a carpenter. The next day, Vijin was working on the ceiling. He used the device. He worked and pulled a heavy cart. He made an effort, but he smiled. He liked everything. The man approached the boss. He was surprised that work was going on below. The chief turned around, saw John, smiled, and confirmed the guy's guess. But the guy was confused. He put his hand to the back of his head. How did he manage to find a specialist? Because everyone was busy. Peter folded his arms and turned away. He has his own methods. It's not for nothing that he's a manager. At this time, Vijin wondered why there were only 3 people here, holding a plan in his hands. Those 2 began to discuss him, believing that he was a kid, and if something happened to him, who would be responsible? Peter turned sharply to the speaker and asked him to take his words back. But John tried to understand why this was so. He brought his face closer to the boss, trying to find out the secret. Closing his eyes, the boss ordered them to count on him, adding that he could become their savior. Vijin looked at the workers and gave commands on where to do what and how to do it. I conveyed the manager's words that the work would only end when a certain quota was reached. The man looked at his watch. If they continue at the same pace, they will finish by 3 o'clock. He walked up to Vijin, showed the class with his finger, and said that he was suitable for this role. The guy seemed surprised. The young man became embarrassed. He put his hands behind his head, not understanding what was happening, because he was not alone here. 7 hours later, Vijin was helping another young man work through the sketches. A few minutes later, the same person was wondering where this guy had come from. The man praised our hero, placing his hand on his shoulder. The person who works best should be in charge. Vijin is surprised by such words and thanks the man, following him with his gaze. After this project, the same man invited him to work on their team. Vijin smiled and agreed, turning around to see the man off. The beautiful, newly built building attracted attention with its brilliance. The guy held a piece of paper in his hands and looked at it with an attentive gaze. He was pleased with himself, met a man who would be the head of a well-known company, and even received the number of another good person. Construction requires people. Every person is dear and important to him. While the hero was immersed in his thoughts, Peter called out to him. The guy turned around and stared at him. He invited the guy to work with them some more, but the carpentry work was finished. So what do they want from him? Peter touched him and began to persuade him to go to another facility where he would be the leader, but Vijin refused. Peter was sincerely surprised. He opened his mouth and screamed. He didn't understand the refusal. The guy handed the phone screen to him. Peter began to look at it. Throwing up his hands, the boss didn't understand how he could get work experience if he was a student. He remembered words from a past life about college and the fact that he was still at a construction site. The humiliation of that day was remembered by the character. He clenched his fists and looked at the sky. A red bus was moving along the road. People were sitting on this bus. There were people on the bus. All the seats were occupied. Among these people was Vijin, who was sitting with a backpack in his hands and looking out the window. Everyone was in a good mood. They wanted to come quickly and live on campus away from their parents. Looking at his reflection in the glass, the guy knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted a diploma. But at the same time, Vijin needs to be sociable. There is no other way. This makes him droop. The guy looked at his phone. He needs to wait a little longer and then he will buy himself a good one. Looking around the inside of the bus, he saw that people were sleeping there. It was quiet. Leaning back in his seat, he closed his eyes and decided to follow the example of the others and sleep. He held the phone in his hand, began to fall asleep, tightly squeezed the hand with the phone, but the hand with the phone slipped down. The phone slid down and rolled forward. Vijin followed it, apologizing to the people. The girl sitting in front, without turning her head, raised her hand with the phone, handing it to the guy. Taking the phone, he was surprised by the girl's behavior and looked at the outstretched phone. The girl sitting next to him exclaimed in delight when she saw the iPhone. Helga, she smiled at him. Handing her the phone, Vijin thought she was friendly. Smiling, the girl extended her hand. Returning the phone to him, she replied that it was cool. The guy looked skeptically at the thing in his hands. Helga and another girl were talking to each other about the scholarship competition. Vijin heard the girls' conversation out of the corner of his ear, turned in their direction, and became interested. He took out a pack of cookies and turned to them, offering them cookies with a smile. Helga was delighted with the tasty treat, accepted it, and laughed. Her laughter was ringing. But the guy didn't give up so easily. He directed the conversation in the direction he wanted and asked to tell him about the scholarship. But the girl narrowed her eyes. She didn't fall for his trick, certainly not for the treats. A bottle of drink and a cookie passed from the young man to the girl. Helga was chewing. She had a satisfied face. There was a jar in the duck. Vijin sat sighing, folding his arms on his chest. The guy listened carefully to her story. After she stopped chewing, he realized that he needed to get to the newcomers' meeting. Looking out the window, he smiled, and outside the window there were mountains and trees. There was snow. Here he is skiing down the mountain, deftly maneuvering, using poles for balance. The frosty, fresh air intoxicated him. Vijin stopped and took off his mask from his eyes. Helga pulled him out of his dreams. There are no such subjects on the schedule. He got angry with her. He couldn't dream, but she laughed and realized that they were classmates and had become friends on the bus. We got off the bus while roll call was taking place, and the guy saw a girl who picked up his phone. The girl had long hair. She looked with sad eyes at the people around her. Vijin thought about thanking her, but Helga had already run up to her and started a conversation. He looked at the girls and realized that she was a good friend, and to say she was introverted meant lying. A couple of people gathered and sat waiting, training first-year students at the Faculty of Architecture. Vijin was there. He sat and listened attentively, and Helga sat down next to him. She clung to him and tried to find out why he applied to this particular faculty. The guy looked away. The girl did not back down. She knew that he was in the army and older than her. She laughed and decided to call him Grandpa. She laughed. The girl understood from her eyes that he was angry, although she knew only one person who was angry because of his grandfather. After the seating announcement was announced, Vijin looked down the rows and saw a guy with glasses. Looking around, he saw the girl from the bus, but Helga demanded his attention. She scolded the young man because he came to study, not to look for girls. Turning to the girl, the guy was angry. He warned her to stop behaving like that. There was a photo of two guys on the phone. If the girl doesn't stop behaving like this, she'll cancel the blind date. She screamed, asked for forgiveness, clenched her fist, but the guy told her to look at herself. Their squabble was interrupted by a voice from the podium, greeting the freshman. Raising his head, he recognized this man and could not take his eyes off him. It was a guy with glasses with a microphone, Kane Prawn, the student council president, praising the new set of freshmen. Weijin clenched his fist. He couldn't believe his eyes. This couldn't be happening. He pursed his lips, narrowed his eyes, all tense. He was angry. He realized that he also went to this university. People around him began to whisper. They heard about how nice he was, how good the president was, from a wealthy family. He clenched his fist and hit his knee with all his strength. He thought about whether to strike first and whether it was worth it. The girl expressed her thoughts that guys are gentlemen on the outside, but treacherous on the inside. The young man looked at her. Vijin raised his hand and showed his finger up, expressing his agreement with her. In response, Helga winked and stuck out the tip of her tongue. She liked this guy. She quickly switched gears, beamed, and asked him about a date next week. He shouted back that only in a month, since the guy I knew had not finished his service yet. Helga raised her hands to her cheeks. She imagined him and told Viggen. He realized that she quickly fell in love. On stage, Kane continued to talk and show projects, extending his hand in the right direction. The two of them realized that this was exactly the project and the event for the scholarship. They leaned forward. Professor of Space Design, Chuck Vorgak, was already on stage. The young man recognized him too. This man was also in his past life. Chuck Vorgak, he is now the youngest professor in the Space Design department, but then in 20 years he will be a very important person. This man was talking about the night. Vijin watched, listened to him. On this night, one thing needs to be done. Draw a line on paper. Training for students is important, including for designers, but with training your color fades, said the man. A long speech, which everyone was imbued with. Competition fuels interest. Scholarship is important. But this should not be your ultimate goal. He ended his monologue. The hero's eyes shone. He finally realized that he had come to study design. Vijin walked with a backpack on his shoulders with the rest of the people. He was lost in his thoughts about the design. He was distracted by a guy who was inquiring about name tags and a story about how they would live in a room of 4 people. Entering the room, he saw Helga and the girl from the bus and an unfamiliar guy. The guy was wearing glasses. He turned to Vijin and gave him a slight smile. Helga ran up to him. She was glad to see him. She was all beaming. They were in the same group. The young man's gaze tore away from the girl, and he noticed something and looked. He saw all sorts of things on the table. Scissors, glue, various measuring instruments. Seeing this, Helga and Vijin opened their mouths. It looks like a store. The guy with glasses attracted everyone's attention and started talking about the room and its occupants. The guy continued by saying that he invited them all to meet. He himself is Ron Beeman. The girl closed her eyes, folded her arms over her chest, and replied that she was the oldest here, 21 years old, and she was Sonia Merple. Vijin's turn came. He introduced himself, with instructions to be on friendly terms with him. Sonia exclaimed. She thought she would be the eldest and leaned forward. All 4 of them settled down in the room. The girls sat on the sofa, the guys below on the carpet. They were amazed at fate when everyone sat next to each other. Sonia laughed. She thought that Helga and Vijin were dating. The guy began to perspire. The girl raised her hands to her cheeks and screamed how she could date her grandfather. Vijin began to calm down the furious Helga, but she did not stop talking about how old he was. They continued to bicker. The others looked at them and thought they were funny. Ron felt sad. He thought that everyone had friends except him, looking at these two. Sonia turned to Beeman. He received an increased scholarship, and his grades were good. The guy laughed. He referred to a little luck and hard work. Vijin stared at the design night brochure. He peered at every sheet. Ron and Helga also buried their heads in the piece of paper. She was indignant at the requirements. They made the frames very large. But Vijin smiled. He knew what needed to be done, so he gathered everyone around him. They all read the conditions and imagined what they needed. Sonia raised her hand to her lips. They all have different tastes, but how can they combine everything? Vijin put his hand on the sheet and called everyone to gather around. He knew what to do. They began to listen to him. They don't have much time. They won't sleep at night. The guy pointed to his watch. They began to set up situations. The young man thought about how to fit 3 in such a small area. But it dawned on Vijin. He called everyone. They don't have much time and they need to decide now. Ron began to resent the fact that they weren't dating now. He didn't understand it. He wanted to be offended, but he heard that Vijin was making models and he became interested in it. With a smile, he offered his help and would supervise them. They agreed. Ron lowered his head, completely drooping. He is the best student. Why doesn't anyone listen to him? He remembered the day when he found out about his admission to the university. He was so happy he did it. But now he was sad. He was covered in sweat. His eyes were still downcast. They made calculations, calculated the floor and ceiling. It was very difficult. But Sonia thought and said honestly, he thinks that this will not be enough, resting her chin on her hand. Vijin raised his hand to his face, agreeing with her. There are too many floors for a family, and you can't install an elevator. Then the guy asked Ron's opinion. He was confused and could not answer quickly. Having controlled himself, he quickly came up with an idea. We need to make pilots, put 3 floors and make the first floor a garage. If they make a space created by separating the building from the ground using posts or columns, then they will fulfill one of the client's requirements. Everyone liked his idea. Everyone began to praise Ron. He became embarrassed. The 4 of them bent over a white sheet of paper, all drawing their opinions. Ron exhaled without taking his eyes off the plan. He proposed making a terrace. Vijin looked at the guy for quite a long time. He was confused and decided if he didn't like it, then there wouldn't be a terrace. But he smiled, showed his thumb. He liked everything, and this idea became a reality. Ron studied the map. There was a river there, so the terrace would be there. Sonia admired him. Vijin presented the picture and agreed that this option would be the best. Turning to the girls, he gave them smiles. At this rate, they will receive a scholarship. Raising his hand, Ron had already paid his full tuition. He didn't need a scholarship. The hero looked at the bickering between the girls and Ron and grinned. He liked the atmosphere. Becoming serious, the character rolled out a sheet of paper to work on. They didn't have much time anyway. Everyone turned in his direction, opened their mouths. They were surprised at such pressure. Vijin worked hard without distraction. He drew, measured, and sketched. But what he saw shocked him. He did not understand how this could be. After drawing a pencil on the sheet, the place became golden. Having drawn a complete plan of the house, it appeared golden in color, voluminous, beautiful. I was amazed by Vijin, a gold print that was seen by the best designers. The guy, lost in his thoughts, muttered about making a good floor plan. Sonia looked at him for a long time. Without looking up from the drawing, the girl's thin hand lay on his hand, showing the direction. The light touch of her hand caused a trembling in his body. Vijin emerged from his thoughts. He looked up at Sonia. She looked at him worriedly. Helga intervened. She looked at her hands and narrowed her eyes and asked about the time. The young man thought about how to distribute responsibilities and rested his chin on his fist. He pointed his finger at Ron. The order came for the 3rd floor plan. The young man happily accepted it. The girls need to think through the design of the 1st floor. They turned to him and smiled. Vijin looked at the plan in his hands. The ladder would need to be installed correctly, but it would still need to be double-checked. Sonia looked at him intently. She felt his experience in this matter. When the guy caught her eye, she turned away abruptly and became embarrassed. Vijin sat down on a chair and began to draw. He was thinking whether to draw along the golden line or not. He looked down and couldn't believe it. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek. While he was drawing everything along the golden lines, he did not notice how he had drawn not only the 1st floor, but also the entire plan of the house. He looked at his drawing. The waste of time was eliminated. Everything was included, both the kitchen and the pilots. Taking a break from the plan, he looked around at the people. Helga screamed. The guy's reaction was strange to her. He thought things weren't going well for them, so he stared ahead. Now is not the time to get lost. It is necessary that everyone's efforts are not in vain. Vijin offered to talk. They stared at him incomprehensibly. He suggested to Ron that he move the stairs slightly to the left. He opened his mouth, but in his head he had already imagined how to do it. Sonia turned to Vijin. She didn't know what to do with the living room, which they decided to leave. The girl smiled and suggested making all the walls out of glass. watched and waited for an answer. I liked the girl's answer. The guy caught his flair for design and showed him this option with a gold print. The idea was good, so they clapped their hands together and came to a consensus. The hero clenched his fist. He must hurry. Ideas are meaningless if they are not implemented. The work was in full swing. The guy sat and showed Sonia how and what was needed. Time passed. It was already late. They glued, drew. Ron and Helga could not stand it and fell asleep while the hero sat and thought. Sonia entered the room. A towel was around her neck. Everyone was sleeping. She saw it. But she also saw another man who was not sleeping. She sweated and looked at him. She saw that the guy was looking at the sheet thoughtfully, carefully studying something. She sat down next to him, asked him to go rest. She could wake him up later, but the character refused. He was immersed in work. The girl smiles, straightens a strand of hair, tucks it behind her ear and talks about winning together. There is a knock on the door. The girl asks to hand in her work. He expects that the finished material will now be brought out to her. Vijin opens the door, hands something to the girl. Her eyes widen. She is very surprised by the work and does not understand what it is. A question arises in her eyes. Then she exhales that it's a good job. The hero's smile becomes wide. Afterwards, they sat with Sonia, pressed against the brick wall and talked, the bruises under their eyes indicating fatigue. Lowering her head, the girl replied that she wanted to sleep. The guy looked at her and smiled. Handing her a blanket, Vijin sends her to bed. She looks at the blanket and a light smile touches her lips. The three stood and thought. They wondered if the work had been stolen from the modeling agency and whether it was possible to build such a house right now. We looked at the work. This is not a building level, but this house is good. Transparent glass, 3 floors. One of the trio, a man, found out that this is a real house, and then the area is being considered. The second man considered this luck, since even the best third-year student is not capable of this. This year's fellows seem to have already been selected. This work not only includes construction but also design. Everything is thought out perfectly. This year will be interesting. The scholarship recipients slept in their room, some how and where, some on the sofa, some on the floor, and some on each other's shoulders. People in a cafe eat, drink, and laugh. Eat chicken, hot, breaded. It is the main dish in this cafe. Our foursome also entered this cafe. They were attracted by the delicious smell, and they stopped, tired. The guys were surprised that so many freshmen came. They were upset that this didn't happen in their time. The tired girls leaned against each other. They wanted to stay at home, but the student council president did not allow them to do so. A guy stood up with a bottle of beer. He introduced himself and asked if they knew the reason for the gathering. The people who were here shouted, raised their fists in the air, meeting face to face. His face changed and darkened when he heard a voice that said that he didn't like this. But then he joked, "This guy can't be that serious." Everyone laughed, appreciating his humor. Only the 4 at the table were not involved. The girls broke out in a sweat and almost vomited when he pretended to be cute. Weijin offered to just drink and raised a large glass of beer to his lips. But when he heard his name and that he was the oldest on the course, he spat out his beer. Helga looked at Vijin's state and she realized that he was angry. The guy laughed, approached the hero, asked about his readiness for the talent show, announcing that he had served in the army. His acquaintances began to whisper. They asked whether he was ready to perform. This presenter was interrogating Vijin. He wanted to know what would happen, a dance, a song, or mimicry. Gritting his teeth, the guy didn't want the hero to ruin everyone's mood. After thinking for a moment, Vijin exclaimed that he wanted bomb shots. Everyone was surprised. The girls opened their mouths so much they stared at them, not understanding. "He will make shots for each table," our character said while opening the first bottle of beer. Everyone was very discouraged by such a statement and deed. Meanwhile, beer was pouring into glasses. Briskly and deftly, he poured beer into glasses, but before that he shook the bottle, causing a volcano in it. He raised his hand to his glasses. The guy couldn't believe his eyes what he just saw. Vijin handed the girls a drink, assuring them that it was very tasty. Just after tasting the drink, her cheeks lit up. It was incredibly delicious. The girl drank a glass and climbed onto the table to dance. The guy with glasses was surprised. She's not like that. He held out a glass and demanded to tell about himself. He smiled, but the smile was not particularly inviting. Looking back at him, Vijin grinned and said to wait a little. He too was no exception and drank a shot, after which he was pleasantly surprised by this drink. His roommates exhaled, each having their own thoughts, but they were all delighted with the guy. Sonia did not take her eyes off Vijin, lightly resting her cheek on her hand, and had a faint smile on her lips. Ron looked at the two and seemed to understand something, but without fully realizing it. The young man looked at the phone. The girl returned home, but something happened. The girl with her hair tied up looked at the phone. She didn't dare answer. Clutching the phone tightly in his hands, Vijin peered at it. He had made a mistake somewhere, since there was no answer from her yet. I opened the group chat and started reading. Everyone praised him, offered friendship. He was popular. The guy closed his eyes, squeezed the phone. He scolded himself for panicking, because the girl was young. You can understand her. The young man heard the notification, Day N, which means it's already today. He looked down through the window and saw the roofs of houses through it, he thought. Vijin came to the right place. At that time, buying an apartment was a dream, but due to the high interest rate, they could not afford it. He approached. The girl was sitting at the table and minding her own business, not paying attention to him. The guy approached, smiling. He was here for a consultation. The girl screamed, scared. Looking at him, she thought that he was too young. Putting on a smile, she asked about the sale of the apartment. With his hands folded across his chest, the guy asked for another story from her. She was confused and began flipping through the papers. She held out her hand with the magazine, ready to show him the floor plan. He began to carefully study the magazine, becoming serious, without taking his eyes off the study. The girl's smile never left her lips. She had already mentally sold something, even despite his age. After the words about buying an apartment, not one but two, the girl stared at him, not believing it. He is even ready to pay the initial payment. Fixed, the hero smiled. Confirming his words, the girl voiced the second amount. She kept a smile. Having clarified a couple of details for himself, Vijin asked questions with a bored face. Hearing that everything was true, he wanted to know about a different type of apartment. The girl was shaking. She couldn't believe it. The girl screamed. She thought that there was a major in front of her so she could get up quickly. There will be no separate registration tax for the right of pre-sale, the guy learned with a smile. Having carefully studied the documents, double-checking everything and reading every word, in the guy's head, calculations of purchase and sale were made, and he was initially happy. With clenched lips, hands tucked under the table, she looked at the document and did not believe that he was young. The guy looked at the seller with an innocent look, clean and open. He didn't have any money on his account at all, but she didn't need to know about that. The girl stood up, bowed her head down, thanked him. He looked at her with his mouth open. The guy came out and stretched. Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the cancellation of pre-sales will be announced. Due to the fact that the place is new, compensation will be paid. The grandees will grow. The young man was pleased with himself. Looking to the side with a smile, he thought what he had planned next there. I entered some building, an empty room with a window in the wall and a door, motion sensors at the top. Vijin came in not alone, but with a woman who told him about this building. The guy thought about the premises. It would be perfect for an office. The woman persuaded him that there would be no better offer like hers anywhere. Turning to her, he decided to purchase this premises and would wait for an SMS. Once again immersed in his thoughts, Vijin decided to think about business. Found office space. All that remained was to find a colleague. I met my friend Keanu Sorg, invited him to a cafe. Watched him eat, muttering offendedly why he only came now. Vijin looked at the guy. 10 years have passed and he is still the same. He still loves to eat a lot. Keanu smiled, took a sip from a bottle of juice. He was happy and full. Leaning towards Vijin, he asked why the others weren't there. He wanted to play billiards or some other game. He looked directly, without a hint of a smile. He needed to talk to him first. Keanu looked up from the bottle and looked at him with a frightened look. A smile appeared on his lips. Then words followed about becoming his partner, starting to do business with him. Unable to resist, the guy spat out the juice from the unexpected proposal. Vijin managed to move his head away, but Keanu's reaction was strange. He started screaming, squeezed the juice bottle with his hand. His mouth was distorted in a scream. He didn't want to get into anything. It's a pyramid. He advised not to linger there either. Vijin began to sweat, raised his hand to his head, closed his eyes. He did not understand the reaction of the person sitting opposite him. He could not find his colleague. 2 little boys were lying on the floor and drawing on sheets of paper. One was wearing glasses. It was Vijin. He was 12 years old, and even then he was fond of drawings. The boy with the glasses was Keanu Sorg. He was also drawing on a large sheet of paper. Here is a boy assembling a robot, concentrating on connecting the parts. All that remains is the head. And Keanu painted the same robot with a brush, also doing his job without distraction. Mom also scolded the two of them for not doing their homework and for having fun with toys for a long time. The guys defended themselves together, saying that it was Sunday and there was no homework. When Mom left, she still gave them instructions to go to bed early. They had been friends for a very long time, shaking hands with each other, cementing their friendship. Vijin tried to talk about his idea. There was no bring a friend here, everything was clean here. But Keanu was still suspicious of this venture, which business does not have risks. But the guy calmly began to tell him that they have something that they like. Keanu smiled, his cheeks turning red. He shouted out a word that they both liked. Vijin jumped up, swung his fist at the table. The guy ducked his head. The hero asked him to think, called him names. Keanu cried, lowered his head. He was dressed in a suit. His hands were down. Who taught him such things? He gave up his dream because of the pressure of his parents. He turned away, buried himself in the sleeve of his suit and sobbed. Now a confident young man sat in front of Vijin, looking at the guy with narrowed eyes. Then I asked him about my desire to open my own design studio. Although he gave up the dream, he still grabbed onto it, which is why our hero chose him as a partner. Vijin extended his hand across the table. He smiled because Keanu correctly interpreted his words. Squinting one eye, he knew he wanted to hire the design guys. In response, also squinting his eye, raising the glass, the hero decided that they would work for them. While eating, he clarified with Keanu that they would do all the work, and that's it. He nodded and confirmed this. Having sharply looked at him intently, the character was almost there. The officer promised to give him a job, but Keanu laughed. He didn't know what they could do for an architectural bureau. Vijin could not stand it at this. He shouted loudly that they would create models. Keanu didn't understand. He looked at his friend in confusion and fear. One word from the model was beating in his head. The hero assured him, asserted that there was a demand for architectural models, and they were good at this business. He was shocked. They can make a lot of money just from their hobby. But Vijin said something that gave Keanu goosebumps, earning this amount for one. This job will be after school. He clenched his fist and agreed, smiling. He had nothing to lose, he would try. They clinked their glasses, as was expected of his friend. Vijin remembered that if not for this day, he would not have seen Keanu next year, and he did everything right. Farther from his dream, Keanu became depressed and committed suicide by jumping off a bridge. A girl with long hair stood and peered into the distance. She was expecting someone. She raised her hand to her head, which was spinning and closing her eyes. She thought that she had drunk a lot. A guy approached her, learning what she was doing here. The girl opened her eyes. She called him senior, but he didn't like it that way. He invited her to call himself a guy, but the girl refused. The young man dumbfounded her, saying that if she wants to get a scholarship, then she needs her affection for him. He looked at her. The girl looked at him. She didn't know what to do. A drop of sweat rolled down her cheek. He bent close to her and asked in her ear about the guy, to which the girl replied that she didn't have time and didn't have a boyfriend. Without noticing anyone, the guy watched the girl. He doesn't like it when she's sad. Unexpectedly, the young man was touched with ice cream. He jumped up and screamed because he felt cold. Vijin handed out the ice cream. He walked by, breathed fresh air, and saw them. The headman screamed, his mouth twisted in anger, and refused the sweets. And Sonia agreed. But Vijin didn't know which one he liked, so he bought a lot and gave her the package. Kira smiled. They had already called him. He had completely changed and was now leaving radiating good nature. The elder was leaving, passing Vijin. Tension was felt between them. He bared his teeth, stopped in front of the hero, and said that he would watch him. But Vijin smiled broadly, thanked Cyrus, and hoped that he would help him. Sonia turned to the guy. She thanked him sincerely. She didn't like the fact that she was attracting interest from the headman. He asked her to go for a walk, and she agreed, Ron watching them. He listened to their conversation, looked with sad eyes and an open mouth. He clutched the jar of drink tightly in his hand. Anger and resentment consumed him. This jar flew into the trash can. He threw it out with force, as if this jar was to blame for all the troubles. Weijin invited her to join him to register for the course, something he had never done before. She agreed, and they walked together, leaning against each other. A feeling of love began to flare up between them. The phone lay next to him on the pillow. It vibrated, but Vijin did not hear it. He was fast asleep with his mouth open. The hero picked up the phone, raised it to his ear, and answered. A girl's cheerful voice was heard at the other end. The girl's voice suggested meeting, but the guy had other plans and it didn't work out now. It was Sonia. She said that all the courses recommended by high school students were filled. Vijin's face changed. Courses for basic subjects are filled out automatically, but the girl was angry. Everything went wrong because of him. He laughed. The guy began to say that she could have applied without him. She would have signed up alone. The hero looked at the phone. Sonia hung up without finishing the conversation. He doubted his words, because apparently he said something wrong. Adjusting the cuffs on his hands, he thought that after studying he would not get a job. Vijin was riding on the bus. He was wondering how to make peace with Sonia. Her voice was angry. The guy in the room was carrying boxes with things. Kinu ran in. He was glad that he was here. The guy came early, clenching his fist and smiling. Today is the first day of opening their office. The first office, Vijin grinned. This would only be the beginning of their new life. He agreed with Kinu, but first they had to sort everything out because they had boxes in the room. By arranging things in boxes, the workers learned where and what to put. The guys were sitting having a snack, but even during it they were talking about work. Vijin looked up from his food. They will soon have a 3D printer. They need all this for work. Keanu, without chewing, exclaimed in surprise with his mouth full of food. He didn't think it was even possible to take a printer. The hero laughed, hurrying his colleague, who gobbled up the noodles very quickly, deftly wielding his chopsticks. A few days later, everything was ready. The office was ready. The equipment was shiny and pleasing to the eye. White tables on which stood only what was needed for work, chairs, everything was new. Vijin leaned against the wall, looked around his place, was happy. Everything looked good. The organization was finished earlier, so there will be time for lunch. He heard voices, turned to see who it was. It was his friends, Helga, Ron, and Sonia. Seeing Sonia, he was very surprised. He tried to look at her, but she was hiding behind these two. This was not Sonia. He was confused. The other girl, embarrassed, straightened her hair. Climbing the stairs, he was already in class. It was a break. The guy walked confidently. Hand on canvas, hand drawing. All this is very pleasant, good memories. Helga secretly whispered to the guy that the third-year student would have to attend him again. The guys were horrified. Studying the same thing for the third time is not interesting. With his hand under his chin, Vijin thought that everything was different when retaking the course. Then they saw Sonia and began to tease her in a friendly manner, saying that she was a philosopher because she wanted to study philosophy. After she asked them to shut up, Vijin felt awkward. Sonia clenched her teeth. She wanted to be alone. Ron began to apologize. She exhaled, closed her eyes. She didn't understand why they were making fun of her. The teacher, Pete McKell, came in. He was in charge of the basic systems course. He laughed. Last year there were only 2 retakes, so he will try. Sonia rested her chin on her hand, lowered her head. She was ready to work. Ron looked at Pete with admiration, his eyes sparkling with approaching tears. Vijin was sleeping with his head propped up on his hand, drool dripping from the corner of his mouth. The teacher began to ask his questions. They were standard, and wanted to hear the answer to them. Ron answered Pete's question, was pleased with himself, and raised his hand to his glasses. The teacher's eyes lit up. He leaned forward and found a smart man. Closing his eyes, he smiled and invited me to come to his office after class. Vijin happily slept through the first lesson on basic systems. He folded his hands on the table and lowered his head. Everyone dispersed. The audience vacated. Someone else remained, collecting their things. A neat little hand poked a finger into the elbow of the lying man. Vijin raised his head from his elbow, waking up, his drool still hanging from his mouth. The girls stood in front of him. They folded their arms on their chests, worried about him, that the professor would take him off. Rubbing his eyes, the guy thanked him for waking him up, but he was wondering where Ron was. Helga replied that the professor called him into the office, so he left early. Stretching and yawning sweetly, the hero understood everything. The girls were not happy with his behavior. They talked to each other while Vijin came to his senses, discussing the course. He looked to the side, rested his chin on his hand. He thought strangely that with 10 years of experience, he did not have basic systems. The girls were interested in his schedule, but he was not enrolled in humanities courses. Helga laughed at this, said that it was cool. The guy became embarrassed and looked away. Vijin replied that everything was fine and he still had time to sign up. Sonia was skeptical about his speech. There would be no places, but the guy teased her. Then he would sign up for philosophy. Helga laughed. She waved to them and said goodbye, saying that they would see each other tomorrow. Going outside, Vijin caught up with Sonia, asking if she had lessons today, but she was free. Turning to him, the girl was wondering where he was. He had a meeting. He was going there. She raised her head up, looking there. She was sorry, but she understood. The hero found a way out. They are on their way home. They just need to go together. The senior students invited her to dinner. She should go there, the girl answered regretfully. He looked at her. There must be a lot of people there. She closed her eyes. Their eye contact and conversation were interrupted by the green bus that Vijin needed. The guy saw his bus. He was surprised that it had already arrived. He had to go. Sonia looked at him. Running up to the bus, he hurried to get inside while the doors were still open. The girl followed the guy with a sad look. She sighed after him. The signs were flashing. The street was clean. People weren't walking, and the advertisements on the buildings attracted attention. Wee Jin was at the meeting, concentrated, and with his whole appearance he inspired confidence. The one he was meeting with was an older man with a small mustache, brought a glass of water and took a sip. The building was large, many doors, windows. Even if it was not for him, the manager would have made a schedule. By pointing a finger at the shadow, problems with the top could not be avoided. The man sat at the table, smiled, and as a result, thanks to the guy, he received a promotion a year earlier. Vijin put sushi in his mouth and began to chew blissfully. He liked this restaurant. The man began to be interested in student life, but the guy answered dryly, "He talks like an old man." The hero wanted to order an expensive dish. The man smiled. He would order a special dish for his magic wand. Having become serious, the man spoke. He thought that the guy would refuse him, because last time that's what happened. But Vijin smiled. He fulfilled his promise to contact him soon. It was his former boss. The young man called him to congratulate him on the completion of construction. But this was not only a reason to call the man. He tensed, waiting for what the hero would tell him. But the guy took the role. He was in no hurry to say the reason for the call, because you can enjoy your food. But the man was already starting to get angry, clutching the glass tighter. Vijin smiled. He ate and kept the smile while the boss was angry. The man was surprised at his calmness and self-confidence, as if the experience was great. Having stopped chewing, the hero finally decided to speak. He was here to discuss work. The boss leaned forward. He was a little dumbfounded because last time he refused to work. But the guy looked expectantly. He was not talking about work. There was silence. Wiping your mouth with a napkin, taking your time, doing everything measuredly and slowly. He leaned forward a little and the guy whispered to Chung-woo, who opened the model house. The man was surprised, opened his mouth and knitted his eyebrows. He did not understand how he knew all this. Wijin continued. The one who opened the contract won the contract by a small margin. The man was at a loss, trying to remember when he was told about the project. The hero looked out the window. Another company received the same contract. When the character focused on this, he thought that then the house would be pushed back. The boss understood that the guy's reasoning was logical. This could happen in this industry. Wijin saw that he had hit the target, and the thoughts of the person sitting opposite were the same. But the man suddenly demanded honesty from the guy. He looked scary. The hero was confused, did not understand what he wanted to know. He had nothing more to say. He leaned forward. The boss wanted to know about the young man's age. He laughed, probably because of the way he eats. Raising the glass, he drank all the water, closed his eyes to continue the conversation, and rested a little. In any case, this is why it is necessary to set a starting point. Eyebrows brought together, the man wanted to know. The guy wants to make a model for an architectural house. The guy did not hide his intentions. He answered honestly that everything was true. That's how it was intended. Transferring the model will not be difficult. This is not a problem, which is why you need to transfer the work to a professional. Once they win the contract, they will create models to sell the apartments. The man looked and in a stern voice asked if he was confident in his abilities. The question that the boss asked is different from labor. It's not just hiring a carpenter. Taking a glass and starting to drink, closing his eyes, he clarified a couple of nuances about the business license and portfolio. Of course, he had a license, but his portfolio was still in progress, he finished. The boss got blown up. He definitely needs it. This is a portfolio. The man got angry. He considered him shameless, because there is nothing, but he gets a job in a good company. He is not a fool. Vijin looked and did not understand why such a reaction followed from him. The sales schedule will appear around the summer. with the model home coming in June or July. Sweat rolled down the man's cheek as he wondered what this guy was up to. Vijin began to smile, put his hand to his chest. He only needs a week. But if he gives me a drawing, the model will be ready in a week. The guy stood his ground. The man was surprised. How is this possible? He has no experience. How can he speak so confidently? But the guy wanted to know where a newbie in this business could gain experience. Vijin grinned. He closed his eyes. If he didn't like the layout, he wouldn't even take the money. This was obvious, Peter confirmed. He was curious to know how much he wanted to get for such an urgent job. The fish was hooked. Vijin was glad. He wouldn't take money for it. There would be no losses on the part of the man in this situation, he rejoiced. But he will throw out his project if it is bad, so the guy needs to try. Narrowing his eyes, the young man smiled. He agreed to such conditions. The next meeting would be in a week. They made an appointment on the second floor in the main office cafe, continuing to eat. Vijin walked holding his phone in his hand, signs shining brightly around him, slapping himself on the forehead and screaming. He was indignant that people had not yet learned how to use this thing. The guy called a friend, found out if his classes were over, and continued on his way. Vijin smiled. He was happy. He has a job. On the other end of the phone, they heard this and squealed with joy. But when he heard about the work the next day, Keanu shouted to make a model of an apartment building only according to the plan. He was afraid. He had never done such a thing, but Vijin calmed him down, saying that he was talented and everything would work out. But Keanu doubted, although the hero was very convincing. He understands such things. Putting his arm around him, he suggested that he present the plan in a plastic model. Keanu's wilt, his brain will be busy these days. The character confirmed this. You need to start work tomorrow. Today it's too late, and you need to adjust your schedule. Keanu was surprised. He didn't know anything about the schedule, and he broke out in sweat. To do their modeling work more efficiently, they need to make maximum use of the modules, especially if it is designing apartments. Modules mean, the guy's colleague put his hand under his chin, that the same structure is repeated. Weijin smiled. He had it all wrong. It would be easy for them to do this job. Keanu's mouth widened, his eyes widened, and he screamed that the guy was able to get the drawings. Vijin tried to explain on a plastic model they need to create the required part as a separate component with its own drawing. The young man has already taken out a stationary knife. They will have to do a lot of work with it. The words about the knife made the character turn around, but Keanu continued. He thought that after the drawing they would cut out the details. But Vijin laughed. If they cut all this out, they will die in a week. You can contact the company, it will cost money, but the laser cutter will do everything perfectly. Admiration splashed in the guy's eyes. He looked at the hero with wide eyes and an open mouth. Initially, Vijin wanted to buy a cutter, but it was too expensive, so Keanu had to go to the company. Stars appeared in my eyes after the schedule was drawn up. The first days were cutting, then assembly, then painting. At this, the guy gave his friend a wide smile. He wasn't going into business without planning, and the work went into full swing. The guys took this seriously and paid attention to everything. The time was already late. Weijin was looking at something very seriously. His gaze was puzzled. Keanu was scared. He did something wrong. There was sweat on his forehead, and he himself began to stutter. But the guy relaxed, smiled. He was going to finish the day after tomorrow, but he will finish today. With a sly smile, Keanu asked if he needed to go to the company right now, but the guy stopped him, sighed. It's too late now. Clenching his fist, he shouted, "Everything should go according to plan. He's doing everything right." It was dark outside the window. In the office, the guys turned off the computers. The light was dimly lit, but everything gradually plunged into darkness. The phone rang. Weijin answered. It would be the son of the boss for whom his mother worked. The guy's face darkened. His mother fainted. They are now going to the hospital. The young man ran without making out the road. He was in a hurry. One thought was beating faster in his head. He clenched his fists, covered in sweat. He wouldn't make the same mistake. Along the street, Weijin was pushing a cart, and there was also a man in front of her who was pulling it. The man was sweating and inquired about the boy's condition. This boy was Vijin. He was not tired, he answered his father, although he himself was all wet. They promised land on which there would be construction and houses would be expensive. Turning back towards the road, the father asked his son for forgiveness. His father's photo was framed, his funeral was modest, but his death was a big blow. In black, a boy and a woman, they were crying, suffering over the loss of their loved one due to stress. He died too early at the age of 40. An empty room, collected boxes, a large window. This was their new home. Mom smiled and asked if the boy liked the new house, and he answered with consent with a smile. Sitting down so that her eyes were at the boy's eye level, she talked about how Mom needed to work hard and he needed to study. Vijin smiled. He will study, make them rich, clenched his fists. She reached out her hand and stroked the boy on the top of his head. She believed in him. She got a job at a cafe that served noodles and worked hard and hard. Visitors asked for their portion. There were a lot of them every day, so she was tired, but they needed to pay off their debts. Wijin was thrown out of his memories and ran into the hospital, throwing open the door. Looking around, he asked the nurse where such a patient was. The wait was not easy for him. A voice came from the side. He saw his mother. She was sitting on a hospital bed and looked good. He sat down next to her on a chair, putting his arm around her shoulders, asking how she was. She smiled at him. The woman raised her hand. She was fine, only the noise was made in vain. She was a little tired, that's all. The woman who was with her screamed that recycling was terrible. Vijin calmed her down, reminded her what happened to her father. Now he will take care of the business. She smiled at the young man. Her daughter was preparing for the entrance exams, and it would be nice if he helped her pull herself up. But Wijin was very busy, so he didn't have time for that. The woman was not offended. She liked his straightforwardness. Now he will take care of his mother himself. He asked her not to put too much pressure on herself. He would make her rich. The guy was sitting in the computer class. He was terribly sleepy. He raised his hand to the bridge of his nose, rubbed it. He was too tired. His eyes closed. Ron stood in front of him with his hands on his hips. He wanted to recommend a class to him. Vijin became interested in understanding global culture. Ron heard this from undergrads. It's for foreign language classes. The guy didn't understand why his friend recommended this particular class, or what was so special about it. Ron smiled. It was a gold mine, but unfortunately Vijin didn't know English. But the guy insisted that you need to be well prepared for the visit. There are no marks. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a young man, tall, with blonde hair. He came in and asked about the course. Ron waved in greeting with a smile at him. Everything was correct. This is the first-year faculty. That guy smiled and waved at them. Wijin wondered who he was. Ron introduced. It was a group of them, Jaden. He introduced these guys to each other. Jaden beamed. He was all glowing with goodwill. He was from England. Squinting one eye, he already knew about Vijin. Ron had talked about him, and also that he was engaged in modeling. The guy pointed to the new guy. He goes to global culture, and he suggested that we go together. Jaden showed everything in order to join this course, but he was skeptical. The guy shook hands. Registration for the course was successful, and now Vijin will take this course. The guy was cheerful and talkative. Our character tried to remember his face, which seemed vaguely familiar to him. Realization came to him. Jaden is British. He realized where he had seen him in a past life. In front of him sat the European genius of architecture, Jaden Port. He sat on a chair and smiled with his eyes narrowed. A white car was moving along the road. It stood out from the rest with its number. It was then, in a past life, or in the future yet to come. There was a teenager in the car who was drinking juice and looking out the window. An adult was sitting with him and the driver was driving. Outside the window there were apartments into which the person sitting in the car put their soul and heart. The clients like them, the man said, but the guy said they suck. The guy smiled. They live in a difficult world, so there is no need to be upset. The debate on this topic flared up very heatedly. The man shouted, splashing his saliva. The man looked closely at the guy. He didn't like him. He was too impudent. It was Jaden. He became a famous architect. Some of his works became a tourist attraction. Vijin was sitting at the computer next to the girl. They were performing some kind of task. Jaden lay nearby. He folded his hands on the table and slept, making a whistling sound. Looking straight, the character was wondering if he had changed the future, but he calmed himself down. There is no need to worry about useless things. And he closed his eyes. He decided it would be fun because he was friends and studying with a future genius in architecture. Vijin got off his green bus, looking around. Keanu behind him was frightenedly huddling close to the character. He had never been here and therefore experienced strange feelings. Vijin laughed, putting his arm around his shoulder. He hoped that the guy would be on his side. Closing his eyes, he asked his colleague not to be annoyed and to relax, but Keanu was interested in what he would do. They came to the cellar to the company. They are the best, Vijin answered. But Keanu doubted that cutting could be done here because there was no service. Entering the room, they saw workers sitting at computers. The girl called her boss, and the guy lamented that he didn't take into account who he is now. A man came out. He extended his hand and asked who was looking for him and for what purposes. The guy introduced himself, told where he was from and who they worked for, extending his hand in response. Vijin smiled. He began to come up with a story about how he knew the name of this man. Keanu was afraid that their business was legitimate and they were not deceiving people. Vijin needs sketches because they want to do a project on a model home. The man smiled. They only take on large orders. They knew where they were going. Keanu drooped at this time. He thought that this was the end. His shoulders sank. But Vijin knew how to persuade. He began to win her over with a smile, telling us what his project was. The guy was distracted by Keanu, who was in a panic and demanded to tell the truth. Meanwhile, the man agreed, saying that there should be no problem with the samples. Vijin imperceptibly clenched his fist. He did it. He succeeded. He was pleased with himself. The guy leaned forward a little, but they would pay. The man offered to drink coffee while they waited for work. Hands extended the finished material. Everything was done and done quickly. The guy was impressed. It was so fast, very little time passed. He thanked me. The guys returned with the material, pleased with themselves, but Keanu sometimes shook from what was there. All they have to do is assemble the model and paint it, but in the meantime, they can go eat. A sudden question from the guy made Vijin turn around. He didn't know how to answer it. Keanu began to reprimand everything that the business had to be built on honesty and truth. The hero smiled at this. Everything was true. You need to be able to trust him. The guy knew that Vijin was not a fraudster, but he didn't understand why they took his word for it. After listing 2 reasons why they are the best, all the young man's doubts disappeared. Calming his colleague, he put his arm around his shoulders and promised him rice soup. After much work, the model of the multi-story building was ready. It was still painted white. It was difficult to assemble the model, but now it is ready. Vijin looked at his handiwork. Cafe. People eat in this cafe. There are places on the street. The tables are filled with visitors. Keanu and Vijin were poring over the model, painting and finishing it. The guy looked back to look at something. Opening the window, he looked out onto the street, breathed in the fresh air, and looked at the cafe. A picture opened before him. One person was supporting another. He was feeling bad and was vomiting on the sidewalk. Turning away from the window, I thought that knowing a shortcut and not using it was the same as not fulfilling my work duties. He liked it so much when life goes the way he wants, he said, squeezing a glass of water. Keanu thought that he had become somehow strange and suggested that he continue working. Vijin looked thoughtfully at the model. He was thinking about the status window. Keanu couldn't restrain himself, bared his teeth, and was already trying to tell the guy to rest if he was tired. Vijin laughed. He decided to make fun of the guy a little, narrowing his eyes. Since then, the hero has not seen a single golden line. He looked at all the drawings. Vijin tried everything but was never able to use his power again. If he has the strength, he will be able to do the job much faster and better. They looked at the finished model and couldn't believe that they had done it. Keanu darkened when he heard about the completion of the work. They weren't even close to the end. Is it really possible to fit all the real apartments into this house? But the hero clenched his fist. The scale is different there. The lips are compressed into a strip, so they will not be able to finish. The colleague could not restrain himself. Keanu screamed, clenched his fists. His mouth was open. They would take a long time to sort it out until the deadlines arrived. There are no perfect sharp edges in the world. The guy turned half a turn. Keanu began to frantically do his work. Vijin covered his mouth with his hand and looked at it all. Putting his hands on his hips and lowering his head, the boss offered to finish the job and show everyone what they were capable of. After work, the apartment building stood and showed off its beauty, neat details. Tired, they sat on the chair and on the floor. They were both exhausted, but they did an excellent job. Their conversation turned to the monetary equivalent. Keanu argued so much that he even clenched his fists. Looking at the guy, he will give him 3 times more. That's how much funding he will have. Taking his hand, he assured him that he deserved it. He had done his job well. A smile appeared on Vijin's lips. Now he is ready to negotiate. The meeting took place in a cafe. The guy and Peter were sitting in cozy chairs and discussing business. The model of the house was beautiful. There was a lawn nearby, trees, high-quality work. The guy stared at the boss, waiting for an assessment of his work. He was tense. Holding his head, he closed his eyes. He's crazy, Peter thought. If he thinks this model is cool, the guy raised his fist and swung. If this is so, then he will destroy his model. But he didn't reach the model with his hand. He was stopped by a question from Peter. His hand hung. With his hand raised, Vijin looked at the boss with a smile. The negotiations were over, but Peter interrupted him. He does really cool and crazy things, and specified how long it would take to finish all the work. The man looked at the guy, frowning. His gaze was focused. He should give this job to him. The guy was putting the box with the model on the front seat. He asked to be careful with this. Vijin looked into Peter's car he was driving and was about to leave. Looking at him, the boss said that tomorrow there would be a meeting of managers. Peter needs a couple of days. He will receive the budget he needs. Just wait a little. The guy smiled and finally said that it would be good news. The assembly was expensive. Vijin went to class and was joyful. He stretched for the first time in all time he slept. The phone rang, he picked it up and was very surprised because his boss was calling him. Peter called and smiled. He had already decided everything. They were ready to provide him with an amount for outsourcing. Instantly becoming serious, the guy asked again about the money. He was surprised at the amount. Vijin liked the amount, but the boss asked for even more, but due to his lack of experience, he was refused. A lot of money was poured into marketing stupidly, like into a homeless pit. People gathered near the Vijin model. They liked this model. They were surprised. The guy's friends were ahead. Sonia turned and saw him. She stopped. Continuing the conversation on the phone, he waved to the trio and was glad to see them. Sonia stopped. A small smile appeared on her lips. She raised her hand and waved back. Now this area is so backward that everyone calls it hell, but in a few years it will take its toll. Vijin wondered why the chief decided to talk about this, but he continued to listen silently. Peter clutched the glass. Marketing decides to open a PR center. Vijin was surprised. He did not remember anything like this in his world. A guy was sitting on a bench, resting his chin on his hand and crossing one leg over the other, he was thinking. Again, the phone was at my ear. We were talking about a deposit. On the other side, they were silent from shock. There, they shouted at him very loudly. The man did not understand how to get the job done by April. The guy smiled. He believed in Keanu. It was too much money not to take advantage of the moment. Now he needs to make 16 layouts. The guy lowered his head. The architectural business requires a large number of people. It is necessary to assemble a team. Due to the fact that the class was canceled, they will work non-stop for the next week, the professor said as he entered. Vijin thought that while he would not assemble a team, he would first go to a lesson with the professor because he won an international prize as a young man. A building was presented that was originally uninhabitable. The building looked like a spaceship. The guy will need to stand out at the professor's lectures. The hero looked to the side. Squinting his eyes, the teacher smiled. There will be no homework, but you need to repeat the lectures. Ron and Jaden were indignant. It was hard and there was a fire in their heads. Vijin understood that it was hard for them. This object was folded, adjusting the strap of the bag. The guy approached Jaden. He was gloomy. The lesson was over, but he needed to digest the information. Jaden was angry. He didn't understand anything. The hero hurried him, but he snapped. Vijin was not offended. He called him and Ron to drink coffee and not worry. Everything will come by itself. And so the three of them sat at the table and each drank their own drink. Ron drank hot chocolate. Raising his head and looking at the guys, Vijin asked them if they wanted to make money. The guys were surprised. Each thought about his own, about full-time work and money. The character talked about work, that they don't have enough hands and will receive money for training. But they began to refuse. One has a lot of his own business. The other has a lot of money from his father. Ron stood up to leave. The others looked at him. No one said anything. Jaden asked not to pay him. The guy turned around in disbelief when they were left alone. He clarified that they would do this. Vijin would explain the lectures and he would help him in his work. They sealed their agreement by knocking their fists against each other. A table, there are open laptops on the table. 2 people are working at them. Seeing how easily Vijin showed his work made Jaden scream, curse, and knock his drink onto the floor. Seeing that the coffee got onto the laptop, he swore even more. The hero laughed at him. Smiling at each other, the character thanked him for his work, to which the guy invited him to go to the club. Raising his hand, Vijin couldn't do it today. They still have work to do. He nodded to his thoughts. Jaden was indignant, he swore. He needed to do part of his work today. The character went out. He needed to go to class and turned to the young man. He asked for a favor, not to speak English with such a terrible pronunciation, but the hero did not remain in debt and said the same thing about Korean. After class, Vijin brought the guy to show him his office. He was impressed. He walked forward. The character could not understand how he became a good architect. Turning around, Jaden said about moving to another house next year. He would call him, but Vijin refused. The guys were busy when Kinu entered and announced his arrival. Having introduced them to each other, the guy named the new employee. They exchanged smiles. Vijin watched as the two quickly found a common language. They stood holding hands. Keanu taught how to use tweezers to insert glass. You need to be careful. The guy praised Jaden and asked him to take a felt-tip pen and start coloring. By felt-tip pen, he meant a thin brush. Vijin, who had already approached, had already explained. The guy liked everything, but he thought about another assistant. Helga and Sonia came to mind. He thought about them. Keanu turned around. He wants to prepare for the exams, so work should be left for later. Vijin invited Kian to transfer to their university, but the guy said that he was beaten with a belt for his reluctance to study. The guy chewed the tip of his pencil. He was lost in his thoughts. His eyes wandered over the lines. He taught only what was interesting and necessary for him, choosing the most necessary. I walked along the corridor, thinking about the second semester, and that I would need to think about the competition. Turning his head, his attention was caught by an advertisement, and the guy stopped. Ron looked at the sheet and thought that it would be difficult to beat the senior classes, but he had to win. The professor looked at the guy's drawing. He grimaced and wrinkled his mouth. Then he couldn't stand it and called him. Aesthetic perception is important, but the project must be actually built. It dawned on him that if he can design something that can be built, he will win. The professor stood behind Ron. He will check and help. He will definitely win. The guy was embarrassed, clenched his fist. He enlisted the professor's support. He liked it all. The girls surrounded Vijin on both sides. They wanted to know about participation in the competition. Meanwhile, the professor was giving instructions to Ron, who bowed to him as a sign of farewell. Vijin approached the poster. Many were interested in this competition. A gloomy Ron walked behind the guys. He didn't even greet them. The competition was not easy and very difficult. Not everyone coped with it, but in the end, the result is equal to the marks. Ron called his father. He wanted to analyze past work so that he would know where to go. Vijin walked along the corridor. He was confident in his abilities. The difference was only in the information. The cherry blossoms were blooming. The hero was walking and suddenly realized that April had already arrived. She poured her petals down, and couples in love walked holding hands. Vijin looked at all this. He thought it was a great time, grinned and straightened the strap of his bag. The girls surrounded the guy. They asked him how to win the competition, to which he replied if they listen to him in everything, then there will be no problems. Vijin stopped, turned in their direction, and looked at them for a long time, as if he was trying to remember something. He walked past them. The young man looked at him. They crossed eyes, but passed each other. Walking a little further, Vijin heard the conversation of the three. They would go to a nightclub. The guy thought that the eldest was too arrogant. He would not be able to take the main prize. The girls called him, Helga and Sonia. They smiled at him and waved. Sonia approached Vijin. He is so difficult to catch. The guy became embarrassed, raised his hand to his head. He works late. At this time, Helga was talking to her boyfriend on the phone. The two turned in her direction and watched her having a nice conversation. The guy's eyes narrowed. He didn't think that they would get closer to each other so quickly. Sonia nodded in agreement. Looking up from the phone, Helga turned to them and shushed them to be quiet. The girl shouted at them. She knows everything about their conversation about models, but Sonia stood up for the guy. They were talking about work. Not believing it, she screamed and returned to the conversation with her beloved. Her face changed from angry to embarrassed. Grimacing, the guy offered to go have a snack. Folding his arms on his chest, she accepted the invitation. Helga showed her tongue without looking up from the phone. She laughingly told them to start dating. Embarrassed, they turned away from each other and began to look in different directions. Ron needs to be warned that after class they will go out to eat something tasty. Helga looked at the two of them. Her eyes narrowed. They looked suspicious. The three of them sat and ate ice cream. The girl laughed. Sonia doesn't know how to date, Vijin choked. The embarrassed girl muttered that she needed to get a boyfriend so that such conversations would stop. Sonia was angry. She heard what Helga said about how she wanted to start a relationship. But Helga has already decided this issue. She took a couple of numbers for her friend. Vijin was eating ice cream. When he heard about the guy's numbers, he couldn't resist saying that Sonia was pretty. No wonder they were interested in her. She heard what this guy was saying about her, became embarrassed, and blushed all over. Helga screamed. She was trying to find out the type of guy Sonia likes, keeping up with her. The red girl replied that she did not have high standards for guys. She looked to the side. Being moderately funny, cute, and tall, all of this fit Vigin's description. The guy realized that she meant him. The girl was embarrassed, but looked at him. There was a blush on her cheeks. Vijin laughed. He wouldn't mind a relationship with Sonia, why not? Helga ran away. It was time for her to go on a date. She smiled and waved goodbye. The guy folded his arms over his chest. He considered her annoying, and the girl thought their mutual friend was very nice. They stood up and stood opposite each other. The guy suggested talking about the philosophy of love. Vijin smiled and looked at Sonia. Maybe she doesn't like guys who like her. She got angry, left without turning around, and told him that this was not so. Sitting on a bench, Vijin thought that if he were in a relationship, he would break up in a couple of days with his work schedule. He glanced at his watch. He didn't have much time left to meet with the manager. The efforts of the past month are about to bear fruit. The young man looked to the side. Several models of multi-story buildings stood on a stand, with a crowd of people standing behind them. They were delighted, praised the guy, called him the best. The work was very good. Everyone asked him questions about where he studied, how he was able to do it. Even the name was memorable. Peter was tired but happy. He didn't think that everything would go so well. They touched the boss with their hand. The young man told him that now he was playing the role of a big shot. He brought good news. The director raised the budget. Peter was pleased. The man was surprised because the manager was responsible for the project, but he behaves as if he was not involved. The guys were sitting in their office. They were eating. They did a great job. Keanu drank alcohol. He suggested it to Jaden, but the answer upset him. Vijin was distracted from eating by a ringing call and looked at the phone, planning to answer. I answered the call. The guys even stopped chewing and held their breaths, waiting for an answer. The guys moved closer to Vigin. They looked at each other in fear and did not understand what had happened. A smile lit up the guy's face. Everything was great. They will create an advertising campaign for them. These two were delighted. They clenched their fists and smiled from all teeth. Keanu was interested in the reaction at first because he was upset, but the guy convinced him that everything was fine. Vijin calmed everyone down, folded his hands on his chest, and offered to have a delicious meal when they received the advance payment. The guys were delighted. They raised their hands to their mouths and gave flattering words to the boss. A whole week has passed. Keanu was interested in the receipt of money. Today is payday. Vijin was silent. He did not voice the amount, but showed the number 3 on his fingers. Keanu was upset. It was too little, even though they are a young startup. To this, the young man said that the down payment was 10%. Keanu thought about it and immediately began to calculate his percentages, how much they were due. Holding his chin, a little time and already the guy's income is growing. Now it's only a matter of time to get rich. He lowered his eyes, pursed his lips, ordered them to calm down. They were not super rich yet. Everything was fine. He needed to do something, Keanu clarified. Vijin took his bag by the strap. The guy gives them a rest. There is a lot of work ahead. Jaden jumped up and wondered where he was going. Turning around, he told them to sleep longer, but he had to go. Jaden shouted. He needed to get ready for classes, and the guy promised to help. They didn't agree that way. But he needs to buy some time, Vijin replied as he left. Standing among people on the street, the guy reasoned that he didn't have enough time. He was going to buy it. There were almost no free tables in the cafe. People sat and ate, mostly in pairs. Vijin raised the glass to his lips and took a sip of water. After all, he can't solve all the problems. A guy came in. He was looking for Vijin, accompanied by a waiter. He walked to the place. The man moved the table. A guy came early today. He scratched the back of his head. This place was close to his studies. The man decided to look after Vijin. He began to pour him alcohol. The guy was embarrassed by this. Holding the bottle, he will now call him Big Brother because he has a lot of money. Vijin treated his friend to beef, and he tensed, suspecting something was wrong. After looking at him, he voiced his thoughts. He wants to hire him since he worked with the manager before. By pouring a drink into a glass, he can give him twice the amount he earns now. They started an argument about how much this guy gets now, but he works 7 days a week. Putting his hand on his head, the man sighed heavily, closed his eyes. Working as a freelancer was wearing him out. Weijin announced the amount he would pay, resting his chin on his hand and smiling. The man was shocked, but the guy considered it a little and planned to pay more in the future. Raising his glass and drinking in one gulp, he decided that he would listen purely out of curiosity to his proposal. He began to sweat. He was interested in this proposal, and the guy better not joke. Weijin brought the glass to his mouth, about to drink. He looked straight at the man. Being born with a golden spoon and acquiring this spoon are completely different. The guy leaned forward. Pointing his finger at him, the man said that he interpreted the concept of a spoon incorrectly. Weijin assured that he only conducts business legally but still cannot pay more. The man doubted. He looked and thought what he should do. He already has a contract. Now he will cast the bait and collect the reward. The man looked at Weijin. He kept thinking and wondering how this guy became like this. Where did he get the money from? The guy told everything. He finished smiling. He will wait for an answer and he will not rush him. But next time he will demand an answer. He clenched his fist and got angry. The man wanted to know the name of his studio and received the answer, Vij Studio. Standing in front of the board, Weijin was looking at something on it, standing straight, hands in his pockets. He wrote down the plan, took a felt-tip pen and completed his actions. What he needed to do, one thing had already been decided. Typically, interior work began with demolition, with a machine with a bucket moving the debris. Hands folded on his chest, a serious look. He could be in charge of a construction site. Taking the phone, he called. He needed specialists to carry out the demolition, electricians and equipment. He persuaded the person on the other end of the line to help him, promised to drink his favorite drink with him. Weijin decided to use everything that was available to him from his past life. An older man was reading a newspaper, a very long and difficult month, not a single client. He was about to leave his phone number and go home early, getting up from his chair. The door opened and Weijin came in. He said hello but behaved freely. Seeing him, the man grimaced. He thought it was a young animal and went to use his toilet. The guy came closer to the man, asking whether he was engaged in the resale of real estate. Weijin jabbered about a certain type of apartment for sale that he would like to discuss. The man was confused. His eyes widened. He immediately invited him to sit down and offered him something to drink. They sat down opposite each other. The guy had coffee in his hands. It smelled amazing, which he told the owner about. Remembering the models of apartments, they now cost a decent amount, but in the future they will have a different price, even more. He put a glass of coffee on the armrest, keeping his hand on the glass. He needs to sell it now, despite all the assessments of the future. Investing is not only about money, but also about time, Weijin said directly. The man began asking questions about the apartment. He did not believe that such a young man had real estate, but the guy announced his price. Continuing the conversation, Weijin can give a discount, but only if he withdraws the money this month. The guy was confident that the apartment would sell very quickly, even if he just walked around the neighbors. Sweat rolled down the man's cheek. He laughed and saw that the young man had prepared in advance. Weijin got up, threw his backpack over his shoulder and was about to leave. If he wasn't satisfied with the price, he would find someone to turn to, since he urgently needed money. The man jumped up and began to stop the guy, saying that he had understood everything wrong. Sitting back on the sofa, Weijin said that real estate around was very expensive. Continuing to wave his arms and talk about the price, the man needs to get more profit. The guy looked at the man. He is a seller. He has a lot of buyers. Sweat poured down his face. His lips curled. He tossed between this sentence and his thoughts. Weijin folded his arms across his chest. He watched the man's throwing and waited. He hunched over and agreed, because he would lose in the end if the guy left him for another. Weijin whispered, barely audibly calling the man. He doesn't want to offend him, since he still has a long time to see him. He will bear all the paperwork costs. Everything will be paid for by him. You don't have to worry about it. At this, the man became embarrassed. He began to smile, asking again and not believing it. But the guy assured that he would take care of it. It would be a discount from him. Weijin will be occupied with the house all April, so he needs to carry out the transaction and receive payment from both sides. The man was surprised by such a salesman, and when he heard about the profits on both sides, he closed his eyes. He leaned over, smiled, and promised to find a buyer for the amount the guy named. The guy, having agreed on the sale, left without turning around with his backpack on his back. But remembering something, the young man stopped and threw it over his shoulder. He was interested in the sale of houses only in this city or somewhere else. Weijin gave the man a task to let him know when the sale of houses in a certain district would begin. He handed his business card to the man, who was convinced that he was a representative of the company. Weijin was pleased. He stood and looked at his account, and a smile of its own appeared on his lips. He sold his apartment at a profit. He had not seen his account on paper for a long time, and he liked what he saw. Looking to the side, he now wondered where to spend the money. Finding investments takes time. He thought that if there was a corporation, the money would not be withdrawn from the account so easily. But taxes, no one evaded them, but the young man simply did not think about them, and therefore did not pay. Weijin entered the building, and there was a woman sitting there who recognized him and greeted him. He wanted to increase the area for the office. The guy looked around, smiling. Sitting at the table, the young man wanted to take away the entire second floor. The woman raised her hand to her mouth and thought. After she told him the monthly fee, she was curious whether the guy would agree. Weijin smiled widely, thinking that it was very cheap. He was ready to meet the owner. Keanu, all wrapped in a blanket, raised his head and asked about the guy, saliva rolling down the corner of his mouth. With his hands folded on his chest, the young man clarified that he did not go home and slept here, followed by a nod from the person sitting, confirming this. Weijin thought, he needs to hire 3 people to work here. He could also hire school children to work part-time. The young man sat down at the computer, turned it on. Keanu looked over his shoulder. He was curious if he was working again, but he was looking through the vacancies. He was already involved in this business, but now everything will be different. There will be differences between bonus and general business. Keanu smiled. This is great. He was embarrassed and praised Weijin, but he immediately became worried about what he should do then, since he works here. Weijin looked at the guy. He tried to explain that he would now devote more time to his studies. Keanu screamed. His hands shook. He was also studying, splashing saliva, he shouted to the guy. The teacher of the basic subject smiled at his students. They will soon begin to take the theory test. The teacher laughed. He would like to give them all excellent marks, but that's not how it works. Weijin darkened. His phone received messages in the general chat. He and Sonia were sitting at a common table. He looked at the girl. She became embarrassed. The girl raised her hands to her cheeks. She wanted to be in a group with a guy. They should try to pass the work with a high grade. Weijin grinned, egging her on. He smiled. She trusted his knowledge. Turning to him, making a sweet face, she trusted him completely. Then they need to take notes and organize it all. The job was difficult. They had to do everything to satisfy the client. The young man looked at the plan and realized that the work was more difficult than he thought, creating a room for a virtual client. Sonia looked at him. She suggested creating a client first. Weijin agreed to this. The girl picked up the pencil, twirling it in her hand, thinking about what kind of client they needed. She asked him what kind of premises he would like because he has a lot of money. Raising his hand, he became thoughtful and began to talk about his company and the number of employees. Darkening her face, she realized and said that this did not suit them. There were too many offers. Smiling widely, she decided to create a room for him, for Weijin. She was surprised by the name of the house with dumplings, and raised her hand to her chest. He introduced his mother's store. She had been selling handmade noodles for a long time, but the store was narrow and cramped. The guy wants to make a beautiful store with a large area. This will be a gift for her. Clapping her hands like a child, the girl laughed. She was pleased with the young man's idea. The delighted guy looked embarrassed. He was flattered that the girl accepted his idea. Having told all the details, Sonia was angry that he was kicked out of such a house. She was all angry. Even the guy was surprised because she was considered cold and emotionless. Everything was fine, he exhaled. It would happen sooner or later. Bringing her face closer, the girl decided to start the concept from her mother's store. Weijin didn't believe it, but Sonia insisted on her own. She aggressively promised to make their project chic. They handed in the work with held breath, stood and watched the teacher's reaction. Weijin pursed his lips in case he didn't like the work. They froze in anticipation. But while reading the work, without looking up from it, he said that the client was unique and that the work was not bad at all. Sonia wanted to capture the client in a realistic and emotional way in the story. The teacher exclaimed that this was great and he would look forward to the project. They were wished good luck and clapped their hands together in joy. Holding the plan in her hand, the girl wanted to know where they would start when approaching the guy. But the guy put his hand on Sonia's head, calming her down and stopping her impulse, and offered her a snack. Her eyes sparkled. She became embarrassed. A snack was a great idea. Rice, eggs, and meat were on the plate. Everything was very appetizing and smelled delicious, and so were the drinks. The girl was chewing food with her mouth full. She was looking to the side and actively working her jaw. Vijin was also eating, but his thoughts filled his head. He thought about the fact that he spoke about his childhood for the first time. Having closed his eyes with pleasure, the guy was pleased to trust such a person. The girl took a spoon. She wanted to know why Vijin didn't eat. If she didn't want to, she could eat it. He will eat. Her profile was visible. The girl was beautiful. She smiled happily. Already at work, Vijin and Keanu looked at the monitor screen. There was a model of the apartment on the screen. They looked at it and tried to figure out what to do next. Keanu was interested in the guy's opinion about the employees. They seem capable, but they need to hire 3. The interview was conducted by a colleague, and he wanted to take the 2 who passed it. Vijin doubted that they were not professionals, but his friend assured that they would learn everything. He stood up, put his hand on the guy's shoulder. Soon he would bring an architectural model, and they would be busy with something completely different. Keanu was wondering what they would be doing so interesting. He looked at him. A model of some product, most likely they will move on to car models. Vijin promised his friend that when they grew up, they would expand their capabilities. The plan was to create an apartment, a headquarters, based on models, which would be decorated on the outside with columns, which would undoubtedly attract people. The guy thought about it. We need to calculate everything, think through everything down to the smallest detail, so as not to be like all the other offices. Vijin ended his speech by saying that now there will be a lot of work, and he entrusts it to Keanu. He was shocked. He raised his hand to his chest and was very surprised at this turn. Now there will be no opportunity to help with modeling, but Keanu assured that he could handle it and beamed with a smile. Over the next week, Vijin visited several companies, and now the income will continue to trickle in. He remembered Sonia and her task. He had to send it to her. Picking up the phone, he held it. Bringing it closer to his eyes, he read the message from the girl. His face was pleased. Vijin was with the manager. He wanted to change the design, make it from natural marble, but the design concept should remain unchanged. The man clarified to make it clearer that the color and tone should not change. The guy started scrolling. The manager looked at him skeptically, waiting for him to choose. The young man chose the soft pink color of marble. The man thought that he was too young and did not yet know how to manage finances. Slamming the folder, Vijin decided that the opinion about the Vij studio was important to him, and he was ready to spend money. The manager was already worried about him, but the guy convinced him that he was in a great mood. Vijin could hear sighs and gasps from the beauty of this place. His right choice influenced this. The manager was pleased with the result, and they shook hands. The guy called on the phone and reported on the corrected design, listening to what they would tell him in response. Vijin walked along the streets, which were green, he called, and reminded them to start work. It was already getting dark, but the guy kept calling and calling. His studio Vij was actively getting to work. Vijin reached out with his phone in his hand. He had finished his work for today. Tomorrow it all starts. The first work of the Vij studio. A large order. They were ready. The guy in the helmet gave orders. They will be built on the 3rd floor. All materials must be taken to the freight elevator. The men talked. The project really turned out to be large scale, but problems arose with electricity. Raising their heads, they began to doubt their abilities. They did not understand what was happening here. Vijin greeted people joyfully, all beaming with a smile. The man was surprised by the guy's age, but without showing it, he came here to start. They looked at Vijin skeptically. There was a lot of work. He would need a master, they thought. The guy raised his hand. He is in charge of carpentry today, so he will hold a briefing among the workers. Droplets of sweat ran down the man's face. He thought he was joking because he was so young. Standing over the plan, he explained what needed to be done. People gathered around him. The man looked at Vijin. He was not stupid and quite capable, he thought. The guy smiled. They must finish the job as soon as possible and he will let them go home. But the man continued to doubt the guy. He was not sure that the work would end so early. Pursing his lips, frowning his eyebrows, the man looked from under his forehead at the guy. He was too self-confident. A check was needed. Sometime later, the worker was doing the wiring. Vijin confidently told him what and how and where. With surprise, the man admitted that he was right. He thought that the guy was gifted. All the workers were exhausted. They were trembling with fatigue and sweat was rolling down their faces. Handing over the drink, he praised the work. It was well done and sent the people home. Taking the drink will reduce your work schedule, but nothing has been done above the norm today." But the guy smiled. Despite the fact that the work would be finished earlier, the salary would not change. Clenching his hands into fists and pressing them to his chest, the man cried, "They will finish the job earlier." A few days later, a girl, Miniel Jo, came and extended her hand to Vijin. Accepting her hand, the man smiled and thanked her for her help in purchasing the tiles of the desired color. She laughed embarrassedly, and it's true that finding marble of this color is not an easy task. The young man looked at Miniel. She would be an excellent business partner in the future. She was only friendly with him because the new company took the order and did it well. The girl promised that she would continue to cooperate with him, since marble of this color would now sell well. The guy raised his hand to the back of his head. He thanked her and used her services. Holding the plan in his hands, Vijin swore, gritting his teeth. Everything must be strictly according to plan. He controlled the entire work process, cursed, corrected. He was angry that the work was not being done properly. Finally, Vijin radiated happiness. The construction was over. He did it, thanked the employees. The workers stretched, took off their helmets. They finished. They rejoiced and shouted joyful words. The director was pleased with the work, the first task of the Viz studio, and they completed it. And an unexpected person visited this place, a bus stop, an advertisement for perfume, and a girl advertising it. The audience was preparing for the start of classes. People came and took their seats. Vijin also took a seat and began to prepare for the lesson, starting to take out the necessary things from his backpack. He heard footsteps approaching him, raising his head and squinting his eyes to the side. He waited. A small woman's hand lay on his shoulder, and he looked at the hand. It was Sonia. He was looking at the guy with wide-open eyes. She pressed Vijin about how he could sit here and chill. The guy didn't understand what she needed. If they are doing a task together, then they need to stay here after class at least for a while. The girl remained in place, but Vijin stood up and walked around her without uttering a word. Sonia looked behind him, bared her teeth. They were ignoring her. She wouldn't leave it that easily. But the guy looked back at her. He suggested that she have a bite of beef first. Large and small, juicy pieces of beef lay on the stove. The smell emanating from them was delicious. The girl was holding chopsticks in her hands, preparing to eat, and pronounced a verdict on the guy. He doesn't know how to work in pairs. Vijin was holding tongs in his hands. He was frying meat. Teamwork for him means turning on the laptop, sketching out a plan, and leading. Just as he was about to bring the meat to the roasting pan, a girl's hand immediately fell on his hand, stopping him. She took the tongs. The young man did not cook the beef correctly. She would cook it herself. Vijin was surprised and didn't believe that she could cook, but the girl convinced him. Handing him the meat, Sona smiled. She was sure her meat was very tasty. After chewing, he showed his class to the girl, but she grimaced. This was not the reaction she wanted to see. When Vijin was able to speak, he replied that he savored the taste of this meat, so he could not answer right away. The girl looked very pleased. She liked the guy. Thanks to him, she made friends. Her eyes narrowed and her face contorted at the mention of working in a restaurant while eating. Seeing how she reacted, the guy raised his hands and tried to justify himself, saying that it was worth trying to work on the team. They laughed and drank juice for teamwork and had fun together. At the restaurant, eating beef and drinking juice, they became closer to each other. Having received the bill and looking at it, the guy's face darkened. From his look, it was clear that he did not expect to see so much. Sonia waved her hand at him. She ate very tasty. "You need to sit like this more often, but only without beef. You don't need to waste money." Vijin got a call from his boss, and he had an urgent matter, and the model of the house he built became popular. Two men, one entrusts the other with a task. Even on a day off, he must work. The next day, people are walking, some with strollers with children, some in pairs, some just hurrying alone. Two guys, sweating profusely, in white shirts, doubting whether they were in the right place, entered the building. A man and a woman walked and were amazed at the beauty of the hall, wondering who did this. Someone appreciated the marble floor. It was very beautiful. Everyone liked it. Everyone was delighted. People looked at the area of the apartments, the structure and composition, and they had a desire to live in this place. The girls began to look back. The supporting actress was standing there looking at the brochure. She also looked at the house and liked it. She already had a desire to move in and live quickly. She saved long and hard and now can afford to buy herself one of these apartments. Seeing a guy in front of her, she made a request to him, taking off her glasses. The man turned around. It was Vijin. He looked at the girl. He was embarrassed. He screamed. It was Vika Suarez. The guy was embarrassed. The girl also screamed. He knew her. It was unexpected. She opened her mouth. He remembered an advertisement from his past. She would soon become a famous actress. Previously, he could not even imagine that he would meet such people. The girl smiled embarrassedly. She raised her hands to her cheeks, apologizing she didn't know that he was the director of a construction company. The guy was flattered. Vika bought him coffee, he indicated with his hand. Vijin was glad to meet her. He asked for an autograph. They laughed together, sitting at a table in a cafe. The girl beamed with a smile. She signed and handed him a piece of paper. Taking the piece of paper, the guy made an attempt, saying that she really didn't remember him. But Vika had already extended her hand and pointed her finger at him one day in the city. Suddenly, the girl pulled back. She got scared and started asking if he was a stalker. But Vicky laughed. She remembered this young man sitting opposite her. "This is the boy who was eating and got dirty in his food." Vijin was embarrassed. The guy said that she would become popular and she would have many more films. Confused, the girl came to look at the house. She saw it in the article. Vijin thought about her. Her career will grow every year because standing still is not an option. The guy looked at Vicky from under his forehead and told her which type of apartment was best to look at. All rooms are designed to look efficient. She understood everything, raising her hand and touching her hair. She lowered her head. The amount for the apartment was large. Handing her his business card, he asked her to call him and he would help. Vision Studio. Sweat flowed down her beautiful face, which means the business was built without going to college. Showing her his student's card, he is studying, so everything is fine. He smiled. With her mouth open, she held a business card in her hand and was delighted that the boy had fulfilled his childhood dream. The guy also remembered Hunter. He was interested in how he was doing. Vicky clenched her teeth, lowered her head, and began to look to the side. One day he disappeared. Vijin was surprised. He couldn't believe what he heard, how this could happen. He just left his bank book and went out into the world. He had to do it. The girl had no money, so she worked a lot. Then she was noticed for her talent. The guy realized that it was very difficult for her and looked at her for a long time. The manager called him. Vijin beamed. He heard that they wanted to meet with him. Reaching out her hand, she stroked the guy's hair. He continued talking on the phone. Vika smiled, looked at the guy. If Hunter saw him now, he would like the guy. Confused, she said that she needed to prepare well. After all, Vika once reminded him that he promised to marry her. She smiled. The young man became all crimson. He also remembered his promise. Now he felt hot. The girl stood up, extended her hand to say goodbye. They would see each other soon. Already sitting at home, Vijin looked at his book in front of the monitor screen. The guy was wondering how he could make this money work, and he put the book under his mouth. I remembered Peter, who said that large areas are not always good. He heard his mother's conversation, got up, walked over, and began to look out from behind the door. Mom was sitting on her knees in front of the TV. She was talking to her brother and asking for more deferment from the debt. Hearing this, Vijin's face darkened. He began to scold himself, saying that it was not his fault for everything. When my father was defrauded over real estate, bad times came, and my mother tried to cope with the debts alone. Snatching the phone from his mother's hands, he shouted into the receiver that the entire debt would be paid off, and there was no point in calling here anymore. By showing Mom his account, he will pay off the entire debt, no need to worry. Vijin looked at her, but he asked only for faith in him. Vijin was sitting in the office. The man was looking through some documents and was serious. Putting the sheets aside, the man smiled. If you decide to do this with the money, then that's good. The guy was praised for such an experience and wished to be a support for his parents. Mom took his book and looked at it for a long time. The guy stood behind her and waited, although she didn't believe her eyes. Turning around, she hugged her son tightly with tears in her eyes, regretting that he should study and not live like this because of his worthless parents. Clenching his fist, he had to pay too much in taxes, but in the end, everything was fine. Vijin looked at the documents and drank coffee, holding a glass in one hand and pieces of paper in the other. He was talking with a man about real estate, thinking through and calculating various possibilities. When the man first heard the news about the company change, he was scared. The man was surprised that the guy was able to predict this, and he was waiting to see if he would buy an apartment. But Vijin knew that the sale had taken place when he saw it. Investments intended to make a profit may fail. When buying a home for living, they would still like to have investment value too. In his previous life, reconstruction caused negativity. He learned his lesson from that. The man smiled, shook his hands. He was ready to sign the contract. Sitting on the sofa, the man wanted to ask the guy. He allowed him to ask questions. This guy probably knows something, so Vijin was asked about it. The guy smiled. He pretended that he didn't know anything and what he even meant. The man narrowed his eyes. He still didn't understand why he was buying these shares. Since they will still see each other in the future, Vijin decides to explain a little. The party that always loses in court is the creditor, the guy said with a grin. Becoming sharply serious, the guy said that if he goes bankrupt, prices will rise by half. Raising the glass to his mouth, he did not say how he knew this, calling it a secret. The man's eyes became slits. He will try to keep the contract with him for as long as possible. Vijin offered to sign the contract because he liked the loyalty system, and he happily agreed. The guy looked at his savings book and was very sad. After signing the contract, it was empty. There is no need to be upset. He can get a good profit from this deal. The young man thought about when to take the exam and how best to do it so as to stay in business. Keanu came in. He showed 5 orders this week. The director will decide whether they will be accepted. The guy screamed. He asked not to call him that, but the young man with glasses doesn't understand how to call the director not director. He looked around his office and liked what he saw, so he expanded his staff. If we move at this pace, then the net profit will be 3,000–4,000. This is good. To be able to take all orders, more people are needed. Keanu suggested hiring more. Putting your hand under your cheek. Premium is quality, not quantity. You need to think about everything. Their conversation was interrupted by a guy who was leaning on the doorframe with his arms folded on his chest. The guy saw him. Vijin screamed. It was Jin. He was waiting for him. This man has adapted well, the director thought. He still has an eye for people. Vijin jumped up to look at Keanu's orders, and there was no need to rush. He threw it to Jin. Keanu smiled happily. He started work yesterday. This made the guy happy. Suddenly, Jaden ran in, out of breath and all wet. He shouted that the competition had begun. Vijin sat down at the computer monitor. The guy stood behind him, folded his hands on his chest. Jaden smiled. He doesn't like competitions, but if anything, he's on the guy's team. The young man's face darkened. He saw the topic, the sanatorium, and this did not make him very happy. Vijin frowned, rubbing his chin with his hand. Last time the topic was the cultural complex, which means the future has been changed. While the guy was in his thoughts, Jaden tried to persuade him to unite and get it done faster. Vijin grinned and looked at him. He didn't think that he would be taken to the team. The guy grabbed the director's shoulders. He was angry, but the boss had a couple of people in mind. He laughed, looked at him, and said, "The blonde idiot is there too." Jaden went to kiss the guy, but he managed to put his hand down and warned that he would look for the second person himself. Ron looked at the piece of paper, read the topic of the competition work, and was also not happy, because he now needs to look for a team to do the job. He put his hands on his elbows, crossed them, and rested his chin on them. He wondered who to choose, brushed aside the options. He dialed the girl's number and invited her to join his team. But she had already joined Vijin's team and could not help the guy in any way. He laughed loudly, raised his hands and eyes upward. He will become the best. Vijin entered the audience, joyful. He radiated light, illuminating everyone with his wide smile, and greeted his friends. But instead of a return greeting, they attacked him with accusations of being late. Jadan shouted, pointed his finger at Vijin. Sonia agreed with him. He was seething. The competition was no joke. The guy asked to come to his senses. With dark circles, the guy realized that these two had gotten along, and he was not happy about it. Vijin sat down. He was ready to listen to what they decided here. Sonia pulled it over and showed it. She drew the facade. It was light. Jaden looked at the girl with widened eyes. She blushed slightly. Such a structure is not easy to build, so it seems that it will be easy to assemble. Vijin smiled contentedly. Although the guy seems stupid, he will become a famous architect. Everything was beautiful and good, but the priorities were not set correctly. The whole trio sat and reasoned together. Appearance is important, but preference must be given to people. A building is a vessel. If it cannot accommodate people, then there is no point in beauty. The girl and the guy opened their mouths. They cried out that they understood the idea. Sonia realized that information for the sanatorium was tedious. Everything needed to be collected and analyzed. Jaden realized that there was something wrong with his drawing and raised his finger up. Patting him on the shoulder, Wijin asked to study the plan for the construction of sanatoriums, and Sonia will analyze the audience. These buildings have a certain functionality. The guy got up. He offered to work in a cafe. After collecting all the data, reconnaissance would be needed. He pointed his finger at the desired sanatorium, which looked like the one that corresponded to the plan. Reconnaissance will be at the Soka Sanatorium. Sonia looked at the sheet and darkened her face. Vijin noticed the girl's reaction, asked what was wrong with her, and looked at her. She looked up at him with her huge eyes and shook her head. Everything was fine. They called him on the phone. He said goodbye, promised to see them, and ran out the door. The young man looked at the phone. It arrived earlier than planned. The manager called him. He was interested in the squares and said that he was taking his work more seriously. The guy listened. He was curious whether the request was fulfilled or not. A girl was coming to meet him. She called him by name and waved to him. He smiled as he continued talking on the phone, waving his hand at her in response. All of them sat together and studied the contract, carefully reading every word. Vijin suggested what was best for Vicky to invest in. She listened to him and decided to trust him. The girl put her trembling hands to her chest, that's all, and exhaled happily. The guy looked at her and congratulated her. It was not easy for her to decide to spend all her fortune on buying a home. They left the building happy with the purchase. They got it done quickly, and all because she had no doubts about her purchase. Vika admitted that she was unsure whether to buy it or not, but when she got to the department, she finally made up her mind. She laughed after Vigin's words that he would buy it himself if he had the money. He had other things to do, so he left, waving goodbye to her. Having found out where he needed to go, she put her palms together and offered to give him a ride. They sat opposite each other drinking coffee, which was quite good in this place. The guy was interested in the fact that she drives herself. And where is the manager? He asked her a question. She liked driving the car, but he surprised him, so young and already running a company. Memories from a past life told him what role she should choose in order to become a rising star. But Wijin laughed. What kind of advice could he give if he didn't understand it? The girl didn't believe him. Becoming serious, he asked, looking up at Vika if she would like to take part in a TV show. She had no thoughts about the TV show, but now she thought about it after the guy's words. Vijin suggested that she somehow star in one of them together, so she would gain popularity faster, and this would help their company. She sighed. She couldn't understand why he was acting like he was her manager. The guy sighed into his fist and immediately grinned. He just felt that way. Sonia arrived a little earlier and stood looking around. She knew that she had arrived ahead of time. She saw a cafe that looked expensive and decided to wait there after all. Sonia saw Vijin and some girls sitting at a table there, abruptly hiding behind a tree so that she could not be seen. She could barely hold back her tears. Looking back at him over her shoulder, she felt sad that she was the only one with feelings. She thought that he was interested in the other one because he did not see her as a girl. She pursed her lips. Tears filled her eyes. Why this world is unfair beat in her head. Someone touched her shoulder with a finger, knocked several times, but she did not turn around. It was Vijin, smiling and telling her that she had come here early. The man looked out the window. He was immersed in his thoughts and looked out the window but saw nothing in front of him. Folding his arms across his chest, he thought that after finishing the final work, he could think about the competition won. This year, he was sure that his work would be the best of all, because everyone helped him a lot in this. Smiling, he looked at the phone. He doesn't have much left, he thought with a grin. He dreamed of a project building and a girl, so he called Sonia, inviting her to join his team. Having not heard enough, she dropped it. At that time, they were sitting in a cafe, and the girl was angry that even the guy noticed it. Vijin drooped, even though the girl said that everything was fine, but she had such an expression on her face the guy showed himself. Sonia looked straight. She asked a very important question to the young man and nervously waited for an answer. Vijin drawled the same one, looked away. He looked strange. Turning to her again, he smiled. This girl is an actress, a celebrity, Vika Suarez. Pressing her palm to her mouth, she knew her, but she still didn't understand how she related to him. The girl continued her reasoning without being embarrassed by him. She muttered under her breath about how he could get a girl. The guy heard everything. He smiled. He heard Sonia's entire speech, which he told her about. Jaden, who was an hour late, intervened in the conversation of the two. He waved to the couple and smiled. Vijin walked past him, telling him that he was a cowardly snail and he couldn't lie. They caught up with him. Jaden put his hand on his shoulder, All three went to look at the sanatorium. The guy made excuses for why he was late, blaming the traffic jams, which were terrible. Jaden was angry. He played a game yesterday and the director knows this from somewhere. Vijin teased him. He liked to make fun of him and see his reaction. Jaden whistled to the side. He took the car in vain and attracted everyone's attention. Vijin looked at him. The guy explained that his father left the car here and he borrowed it. The young man took a pencil. He wanted to capture the place after the discussion. The young man looked at him skeptically. Maybe he could take a picture with his phone or take a photo. Sonia looked at the guys. She stood up for Jaden. His sketches make sense. She put her hand to her chest and expressed her idea that when she told everyone the plan, it would be possible to arrange the sketches beautifully. Jaden praised Sonia, blushed all over in embarrassment. She understood his idea, but Vijin did not. The young man raised his hand to his lips and thought, he can win in modeling, but he needs help in composing a composition. He closed his eyes. He was pleased with the people he chose. He has an excellent team. They decided to go to the sanatorium, and a young man met them at the entrance. He did not greet them very friendly. If they are not guardians, they will not be able to come here. The guys began to shake. Vijin tried to persuade, folding his hands in a prayer gesture. Sonia looked at it all from the side. The men were distracted by the girl's voice. They both looked at her at once, waiting. She was the guardian of one of the patients. Her hair flowed as if from the wind. She was beautiful. In the ward, there was an old woman lying on the bed. He was in pajamas. Everything was done on top for convenience, calling a doctor and an outlet. The girl looked at her grandmother. The guys stood behind and whispered. The woman got up with the help of Sonia. She did not understand why the girl had come here at such an hour. The girl narrowed her eyes and smiled at her. She was bored, that's why she came. The guys came closer. They brought syrup with them and introduced themselves as Sonia's friends. She was very pleased, but she still didn't understand why they came. The trio sat at a table on which there were a lot of snacks. They did not touch the food yet. They only looked. Sonia skewered a rice stick on her fork, and she salivated at the smell. Vijin folded his hands on his chest, wished them a bon appetit, and watched his friends eat. The guy praised them. They did a very good job today. They got to the sanatorium and arrived by car. Vijin looked at Sonia for a long time. He didn't even think about the difficulties she had to face. Remembering the conversation with my grandmother about how she is the eldest and looks after the younger ones. Sonia is worried that the guy is not eating, but he is full and will see how he eats. The girl with a sweet smile handed him a cutlet on a fork, indicating that he needed to eat it. But Jaden jumped up and snatched this cutlet with his mouth, taking it away from under Vijin's nose. Pointing his finger at the guy with his mouth full, he began to say that he wouldn't get rid of him so easily. Gritting his teeth, Vijin whispered that the food here is expensive and it costs 10 such trips. Sonia intervened. She wanted to know where the guy's office was located, next to the university. Vijin offered to finish eating and go there, but Jaden got in. He didn't want to go there, it's hell there. Leaning towards him, the guy hissed that he was going too far. Jaden leaned back and turned to Sonia that she needed to run away from such a guy. But the girl was not afraid. She was most interested in what the guy was doing there every day. Turning to the girl, he wanted to know if she would go to his office. She nodded with burning eyes. Having called her, having finished with food, they were about to leave, but Jaden also got ready with them. He also wanted to go there. Sonia smiled. She fell behind the guys and shouted to them that she would buy drinks, straightening her hair. Vijin tried to stop her, but she just grinned and called him careless. Jadan put his arm around the guy's shoulders and began to explain to him that she was giving him time on purpose. Upon entering the office, the boss saw a guy on the couch, sleeping and drooling from his mouth. Vijin tore the blanket out from under Keanu, throwing him to the floor, and screamed about an emergency. The guy was shy. He scratched his head. He had to clean up very quickly. Having opened the door, he was dumbfounded. He saw a girl and did not know what to do or what to do. Sonia stood and didn't know how to react to this guy. She was embarrassed. Keanu walked abruptly past Wijin, did not look at him, leaving the breeze. The guy began to get hysterical about the fact that an unrealistically beautiful girl, like a goddess, rang the doorbell. Vijin opened the door and let her in. Now he will introduce him to those who believe that she is a goddess. Keanu opened his mouth, opened his eyes wide. He did not believe that such a girl came to them. Vijin began to tease his friend. He jokingly began to choke him. The girl laughed. Sonia calmed down from laughing, extended her hand to the guy and introduced herself. Embarrassed, Keanu introduced himself in response. He bent over and extended his hand to her. The two surrounded them and looked at them. Vijin warned that they were preparing for the competition, so there was no need for fuss. He couldn't let Sonia and Jaden's efforts go in vain. They all looked at him. These words were unexpectedly pleasant. A few days later, the trio sat at a large table listening to Vijin. Sonia raised her fist. She was glad that they looked at the sanatorium. Now they can kill everyone. Vijin looked at Jaden. He couldn't concentrate, and the guy didn't like it. The guy didn't notice anyone, spent time behind the drawing, not hearing anyone or anything. The boss knew that Jaden was worth relying on. His creativity is amazing. His experience and Sonia's scrupulousness make the project very profitable. The girl and the director were discussing where to put the stairs. Jaden was lying on the sofa, looking at them and sighing. Sonia leaned back in her chair and looked at the guy who was lying on the sofa. She closed her eyes and laughed. She turned to him to quickly finish and eat. But the guy didn't react. Then the girl got up and walked up to him. She had little time left. She needed to try. He folded his arms across his chest and did not want to design a building for the competition. Sonia screamed. She didn't understand how this could happen, and she was scared. Vijin raised his hand to the girl. She stood as red as a lobster. He tried to calm her down. The boss sat down next to the guy and started talking about how they were a team and they could share their experiences. The problem was that he did not know why he was studying construction and design. The girl raised her hand. She believes that she can use all this. Vijin believed that they were simply improving the buildings and was worried that the guy might have star fever. Jaden was very worried about pushing himself into the confines of functionality. He jumped up and shouted that the boss's design was beautiful, but he wanted to draw something more beautiful. Here he was maneuvering on a skateboard, keeping his balance and rolling down the mountain, deftly and gaining more and more speed. To develop an architectural design that no one has ever seen before was his dream. Sonia gritted her teeth. You can't focus on aesthetics, just on that alone. He argued and argued, proving that he was right and to be heard. Succumbing to his memories, he saw himself as a boy who also wanted to create the most beautiful building. Sonia screamed, trying to get through that this was a sanatorium for the elderly, and what was needed was functionality. They shouted, they argued with each other, raising their voices to shout over each other. Vijin turned dark. He asked the guy how much he himself knew about the implementation of projects. Sonia patted the young man, who instantly became sad on the shoulder. No one began to argue with the boss's experience. She gave an example of past work that they were able to adequately present. Putting his palm to his face, he dumbfounded everyone about leaving the team. Again, tension began between the two of them. They could not make peace in any way. Vijin, without saying a word, silently began to tear up his project. The white sheet split in half. When the couple realized what was happening, they only saw pieces of paper falling to the floor. He said that experience and practice should not be neglected, but it reminded him of something important. They are still students. They have time to try something new. Vijin hugged his friends. All the while, he created a core, not a shell. This time, he will create a shell and then fill it with contents. There is no need to focus on the competition. They will each make a sketch. Let this be history. Everyone took up the pencil, including Vijin. The picture was looking very good. The guy thought that at this pace there was a chance to win. But suddenly, the guy realized that the golden drawing had disappeared. He could not believe it and was upset. Sarah and Jaden were alarmed. They looked at the guy. What happened? He looked upset. Vijin looked at his drawing. He disappeared, raised his hand to his mouth. He wondered why this happened. The guy wondered and thought. He remembered Kinu's words that he must create perfection. His friends stared at him. They began to tell him that it was time to move on to the main business, that the drawings were enough. Turning around, the guy was obsessed. He had to draw something else. Jaden realized that the boss had taken the matter seriously. The lights had already been turned on, and they were working. Sonia also wondered what was happening to the guy, why he was working so hard, and Vijin bent over the plan and finished drawing, finishing, and it seemed to him that everything was wrong and wrong. The girl wanted to touch the guy, but pulled her hand away, looked at her and decided not to interfere, but simply trust him. Jadan was lying on the sofa with his arm under his head and sleeping. He quickly passed out from fatigue. Sonia put her hands under her head and slept on the table. She fell asleep sitting up, and only Vijin, while everyone was sleeping, worked and worked, drew and drew, fulfilling his ideal. The next morning, the man tried to hang something up and measure it. The girl jumped up to Vijin. He did not sleep all night and worked. Jaden also cried out indignantly about this. He asked the girl to look and say which one was better. The plans lay out before her. Looking through plan after plan, Jaden and Sonia tried to decide which one, exchanging glances at each other. Despite the fact that the boss worked all night, in their opinion, the best was yesterday. Vijin lay down on the sofa, shielded himself from the views of his friends with his elbow. He needed to rest. The girl sat down on the edge of the sofa. She understood that the guy had not been himself lately, and you couldn't get close to him. She looked at him. There was no answer. She told him that he needed to rest. And here is a guy pounding an ice wall that has no end and edge, and he is with a small hammer. There is no need to build according to plan. Vijin's eyes lit up with a bright light. He realized what was happening and beamed. But the couple in his head did not appreciate his efforts. The building was not what they wanted. He tried to find his friends, shouted and called for them. Where they were, he wondered. Opening his eyes, he screamed so loudly that it was difficult to stop. All wet and trembling, he put his hand to his forehead and looked to the side. Clenching his fist, the guy called Sonia, but no one came to him. He remained sitting. Walking out of his office, he scratched his head. Where could they have gone, he thought. Looking around, he slept for a long time. It was already night on the street. The man was confused. He walked back and forth, looked down, up and to the side. What was he missing in this sanatorium? Suddenly, as if a golden glow was beckoning him from a trail of perfume, he looked at it. There was food on the counter, various foods, boiled, fried, smoked, everything in large quantities. Sonia extended her hands, taking the package with her order. She smiled joyfully because they would eat soon. Jaden walked next to him and gnawed on a chicken leg. The girl smiled joyfully. They stopped, saw Viggen, and suddenly braked, not understanding what was wrong with the guy. Sonia watched the young man with concern, wondering why he was going somewhere. They followed him, wondering what was wrong with him. The guy even suggested that he might have a girlfriend, but Sonia denied this. She gently touched Vijin's shoulder with her fingers and asked what he was doing here. But the guy pointed his finger somewhere to the side, asking if she also saw the golden ray. Jaden and Sonia didn't see anything. They were scared by the guy's behavior. Friends became worried about him. The girl came up and asked if everything was okay. The guy began to tear out the hair on his head, standing behind them. But Vijin saw the golden glow of the playground and did not take his eyes off it. He turned to the couple. He decided to go back. He found what he needed. When they came in, the guy immediately started drawing. He worked, and tried. Jaden and Sonia looked at the young man with all their eyes. The guy's eyes even narrowed from tension. They came up to see what the drawing was. A golden glow came from it. They opened their mouths. From under his forehead, he looked at them. A strange drawing, he knew it, but he wanted to see their reaction. The drawing was on the table. Vijin had no common sense at all. Lowering his eyes, the guy reminded his friends what Sonia's grandmother said. The friends' memories again brought them back to their meeting with their grandmother, when she asked the girl who her fiancé was from these two guys. They wanted to hear the story from their grandmother, and she was going to tell them. Vijin leaned forward, interested in the experience of what to do in a nursing home. At this point, Sonia got involved, and she wanted to know about the happy years here. The whole trio looked expectantly at the woman. They were waiting for her answer. The grandmother talked about the internal structure of the sanatorium, what she would like to improve and correct there, its advantages and disadvantages. Her story made the guys think. They said goodbye to her and went to draw. The woman was tired of her story, lay down exhausted on the pillow. She did not understand what benefit her story would bring. Sonia laughed. She will definitely tell everything another time, but now they need to leave. The guy returned to the girl and did not understand what she meant. He was puzzled. Vijin understood that people here needed something more. A person needed a person. Jaden was embarrassed, covered in a hail of sweat. He decided that they needed a nurse. But it was not like that. Warmth, a family circle, their relatives. That's what these people need. Sonia was embarrassed. She raised her hand to her mouth. She would like to visit her grandmother more often, but the atmosphere of the sanatorium is not conducive to this. The guy folded his arms across his chest. Convenience was a top priority for people with disabilities. He threw out options for his plans, a children's cafe where there would be grandchildren, various photo zones where relatives can leave memories. Smiling, he suggested changing the worldview of a nursing home, a place where people want to leave their old age. Even if you don't feel well, your loved ones will make you happy. The grandmother considered that her opinion would not affect anything. They just needed to build it. Viggen realized the value of design, and the last detail came together just right. Jaden beamed with joy. He was ready to do something that had never been done before, and clenched his fists in support. Sonia was puzzled. There was too much for them to do. Drawings, models, and panels needed to be done, but there was not enough time for all this. The guy brought his face closer to her. He was delighted that she supported him and decided to trust him and his plan. Viggen took the pencil in his hand. He was sure that this time his drawing would be correct. The friends looked in surprise at the young man's drawing. These golden lines were clearly not clear to them. Sonia looked at Viggen. He did it all so easily and quickly. He drew it as if he knew the result. Having made a drawing, he put his hand down and asked his friends for their opinion on how they liked this option. Jaden raised his hand to his mouth. There were tears in his eyes. Sonia was also impressed. The guy took into account everything, all the moments. Viggen was embarrassed. He raised his hand to his face. He was pleased that the guys liked the drawing. He stood opposite the girl and now allowed her to go home, smiling at her. But Sonia was upset. She didn't understand why she had to go home. Viggen regretted that they wasted time because of him. It was better to switch roles. They will spend time working on the models, and Sonia will be in charge of the interior design. But the girl screamed. They mean they are making a model, but the model is on a different level. But Viggen had experience. He accumulated it by fulfilling orders, he told his friends. The guy looked at Sonia. He hoped that she would believe him this time. She looked at him. A barely noticeable smile touched her lips, and she agreed with him. Viggen abruptly embraced her. She was dumbfounded by this action, and he squeezed her and thanked her for believing in him. Jaden opened his mouth at what he saw. Tears fell from his eyes. He was shocked. The girl screamed, blushed, and felt hot from all this. I pushed her away from me. She was still embarrassed and asked for forgiveness. Sonia looked at him smiling. They would see each other in 2 weeks. Hugging Jaden, he began to smile. Let's get to work right away, but he cried out that he was hungry. But the guy laughed at him and asked him to show a hungry spirit at work. Jaden sat over the plan, holding a pencil in his hands, looking and thinking, doing his job. Keanu joined them and also helped them work, calculate, and connect. The girl was also sitting at work at the computer. She had a design. She thought through everything. She received a message from Jaden on her phone asking her to save him. He was roaring and already tired. She took the phone and brought it closer to her face. Smiled, she was pleased. The girl brought the photo closer. There was Viggen in the background. 2 weeks later, Sonia stood in front of the office door. She took a camera with her. Opening the door, she carefully looked inside and asked forgiveness for her intrusion. The girl walked past Jake, who was lying exhausted on the sofa, and advised her to run. Sonia opened the door and walked in, stopping at what she saw. She saw the model that the guys made. The model shone with a golden color. Viggen came out of the shower, drying himself with a towel. He saw Sonia when she arrived. She laughed and became embarrassed when she saw the guy, pointed to the model and said that he was very beautiful. If her grandmother is in such a place, then she will want to visit her more often. Hugging her shoulder, smiling down at her, he was pleased. She held her breath at the gesture. Sonia was embarrassed but invited him to take a photo and looked directly at the young man. Viggen turned towards Jaden and invited him to also take a photo with the model. The girl was embarrassed. She thought about taking a photo together, but it didn't work out. The three of them stood up. Jaden yawned and rubbed his eyes. Sonia grabbed Viggen's hand and he glanced sideways at her. The guys stood up with the model. The boss stood up with his hand up, and Jaden was fiddling with the models. Sonia adjusted the lens. She was filming the guys, deftly commanding them what pose to take and how to look. The young man looked at the girl. He forgot about the pictures, but she took care of it. Standing next to the girl, he said that the cameras on the phone in the future would take very good pictures. Sonia showed the guys the photographs. They were impressed, but Viggen's opinion was important to her. Jaden showed class. It is clear that the girl was taking photographs. Laughing, she managed to learn a lot of things while working part-time. Jaden beamed. He asked Sonia to teach him how to take photographs. The panel is ready, and the image of the model is completed. Let's start with the guy finishing the reception. And finally, they finished, clapping their hands to each other, a smile beaming across them. The man sat and drank tea from a mug. 11 teams reached the finals. The men agreed. This is a good result. Even this did not happen that year. One of the men raised his hand, this year's active freshman. The guy was happy. He called his father and said that he had made it to the finals. Jaden hugged and kissed Viggen, who hugged him joyfully. The men continued the conversation. They discussed victory forecasts. If you tell what the man watched and began his story, then Ron and the professor are in the lead, but there is also Vision's team. But remembering Vision's team, he also remembered that Ron was part of it. The man realized that he had never seen the guy's work, so he thought about it. These two leaders can receive a reward, so they don't have to worry about anything. Even if they receive this award, the dean concluded that this is an excellent result for the freshmen. Wanting to see in person how their children receive the award, the man headed towards them. A young man was driving along the highway in a car. There were girls in the car who surrounded him. The girls fawned over him, saying that he did most of the work. Putting his hand on his forehead, he lied to them, but he himself thought that he knew the truth, that he did nothing. Darkening his face, he looked straight with some kind of anger in his eyes. He would not make you regret that they worked with him. After adjusting his glasses, he stopped in front of the stairs at the entrance to the hall where the final work would take place. He took the hands of his companions, and today they are the main heroes of the day. He had a lot of practice. If the reward is not his, then he would be better off dead. He walked forward, confident in himself. At the top, he saw Vision's team. They were looking at him, silent and just watching. The girls jumped up. They saw the team model and admired it, and the guy stood behind and was angry. He approached Vision, squeezed his shoulder tightly, and praised his model with sarcasm. Sonia, hearing this, began to come up and scream, but the guy stopped her with a gesture. Vision looked at him. He was looking forward to the announcement and followed him with his eyes. The man grimaced and thought that this was absurd and should not be broadcast anywhere before the announcement. Jaden and Sonia were seething with indignation. They shouted that they would show him, but the boss calmed them down. The young man looked at Kira's back. Let him not disappoint him today, because today is the end for him. In the audience, people walked around and looked at the models. The show was free. The judge, Jean Riviere, raised his hand to his mouth. It was a bald man with glasses. The second judge, Bruno, looked at the work. The quality of the freshman was much better. Someone asked to take a closer look at his project, and not only because it was his son's project. Judge Zan had doubts. He was promised a reward if everything went as expected. The third judge, Angus Rock, also walked around and looked. He could not believe his eyes that this work was done by freshmen. The judges tried to confuse each other, each pursuing their own goals. Vision gave his speech and presented his project. All the judges sat and listened to the defense. The first thought why he defended the project so well. Vision pointed his finger to the side. If this is not architecture, then what is called it? Bruno folded his hands in admiration of the guy's work. The judges looked at each other. He lowered his folded hands down and regretted that he himself had not thought of such a thing. Bruno leaned forward, staring expectantly at the project, which was limited in design. Vision continued to demonstrate his project, which contained all the valuables for the nursing home. This project is very important. It was built through trial and error, but it contains everything optimally. The professor folded his arms on his chest and smiled. How is this possible? He thought. Sonia supported him, clenched her fist for him. He's doing great. There were also girls who were sitting next to Kira. They tried to smooth out the situation with his performance. When part of the speech turned to questions and discussions, Bruno raised his hand. The rest of the judges looked at him. The design is beautiful, but it's more of a street cafe than a sanatorium, he concluded. The first judge agreed that care for people with disabilities had been forgotten. Such a decision benefited him. The dean was angry, he swore. They did everything right. The man next to him supported him. The young man was jubilant. He smiled joyfully, feeling his superiority over the guy. But Vision lowered his head and smiled. He smiled knowing that this was not the end. The man with a bald head, the judge, was shocked. He did not believe that the guy was standing in front of them and smiling. The young man agreed with the words, but continued that they also considered the design that the teams turned to. The first judge folded his arms across his chest and began to argue with the guy that he did not see the amenities. To this, Vision said that convenience is not the first indicator. Holding the microphone in your hand, without looking away, this is not a space for adults, but for grandchildren. The young man raised his hand to his forehead. He reproached the man on stage because he would ruin everything like that. The members of the judges fell silent in admiration. They could not squeeze out a word, amazed by the guy's words. Each of these people who were on the jury imagined how their grandchildren come to them and spend time together, ride on a swing. or the whole family is together eating delicious food, laughing, they are all nearby. Sonia also did not take her eyes off the speaker. The words that came from his lips penetrated straight into her heart. Bruno smiled faintly. The design is not only for convenience, but also for happiness. Vijin bowed, closed his eyes. His speech was over. His presentation was over. People in the hall stood up and began to applaud. They stood and smiled at the guy's idea. The judge also stood up and clapped, but the first judge sucked in his breath. He was unhappy. The dean and his assistant clapped and tears streamed down their faces. They thought the presentation was wonderful. Kira also clapped, but looked at the stage like a wolf. He will win the main prize, but for now, enjoy your little victory, enemy. After everything, the guys stood opposite each other and looked not very friendly. The dean folded his hands and thought that this was a very inconvenient situation, even though the first and second places were ours. They sat down. Vijin did not deserve the prize, Kira complained, looked at him disapprovingly. The guy blew himself up. He shouted that the honor of the school was under threat, and how older he was ready to give advice to give the award himself. Vijin's face darkened, but he was silent. He just sat and looked at this outburst of anger. Ron was in the audience packing his books into his backpack. He was busy with his thoughts, and when the girl came up to him to congratulate him on his win, he shuddered. The professor approached the couple and said that the guy did not win this competition. Ron screamed. Vijin's foul play should have disqualified him. At this time in the office, Vijin raised his head high and asked about the evidence. Cyrus folded his arms smugly on his chest, smiled maliciously. He had plenty of that. The guy was confident in his work. Sonia and Jaden worked with him. The dean shouted at Vijin. He called him here not to play with words. He looked at the guy menacingly. The guy, it turns out, was going to outsource the plan, layout, and everything else, Cyrus cried. Vijin picked up the sheet, read it, and had one question. How did they get it? The young man threw his hands up and smugly said that a freshman couldn't be better than him. Hanging over Vijin, he threatened him, wanted him to beg for his life. Pursing his lips, lowering his head down, he didn't take the guy's words seriously. He thought about how stupid he was. The dean intervened and said that admitting one's mistakes is also a skill. Looking around, he smiled. Okay, after a while his innocence will be revealed. Cyrus grimaced. He kept talking about the evidence, clenching his knees with rage. Vijin turned to him. If his award were cancelled, then the main prize would be yours. The man's phone rang. He was distracted. They looked at him, waiting. Vijin raised the mug of tea to his mouth. There is no problem with the reward. The job has been proven. The other guy screamed. He was covered in sweat. His face was covered in anger. He didn't believe it. The man grabbed his head. He would like to praise him, but since he did it without the help of the professor, he cannot find praise for him. But Kira's award, the voice continued to sound from the speaker, will be cancelled, since the work has already been recognized by another company. Vijin folded his arms over his chest. He laughed. Apparently, the guy thought that he too had received help, since he himself asked for help. He jumped up, grabbed the guy by the chest and shook him. He screamed and got angry. But in response to this cry, Vijin showed him his business card, Vij Studio. As he was leaving, he turned around and saw how Cyrus was trembling. The guy was walking forward, and he was left behind. The man's red face was sweaty and angry. He could not restrain himself from shouting at the remaining guy. Cyrus grabbed his head. He tore out his hair. He sobbed. He didn't understand how this could happen. Vijin came out and saw his friends. He went straight to them. Jaden stood stretching, and Sonia clasped her hands. Seeing him, the girl smiled radiantly. Sparkles danced in her eyes. He was pleased with the concern of these two and offered to have a snack. The young man came up and put his hand on Sonia's head. They can eat beef. Jaden began to dance joyfully. His saliva began to flow from the word food. They decided to call Kinu because he also helped them. Kinu helped them. He prevented a fight, and all because Cyrus left notes on the school computer. Vijin smiled when Jaden was about to run. Pressing the key fob, he allowed him to go, and he and Sonia would go by car. Getting into the car, the girl wondered where he got the money from. Jaden was already sitting in the back seat and commented, saying that he had taken the winnings. Getting behind the wheel, the guy said that he was a representative of the company, and he needed the car for work. The guys talked to each other. One begged for a gift for himself. The other refused. The guy was sitting in the airport building. He was gloomier than a cloud. He was annoyed by the people who walked here and there, flickering before his eyes. But most of all, he was annoyed by the person because of whom everything happened. His father shouted at him. He did not listen to pathetic attempts to justify himself. He got up and went to boarding with his suitcases. His father sent him to study with Bruno. The third judge, sitting at the table, congratulated Viggen on achieving his goal and winning. The guy raised his hand and scratched the back of his head. He smiled. He was pleased to receive a compliment from Bruno. The young man brought a mug of tea to his lips. He grinned into the mug. The construction company chose the most famous one. The man looked at the man who was swearing at him. He put his hands behind his head and stuck out his tongue. Bruno straightened up and looked at Viggen. He invited him to work with him in his company De Pinos. The judge was upset. He wanted to take the guy to Spain. His hand was under his chin. But the guy smiled and handed over his business card. He expanded his office. He looked carefully at the card in his hands and realized that he already had his own studio. And he asked his question whether he was satisfied as an architectural designer in this small country. Weijin remembered all the events and said that this small country is his home, and it is dear to him. Opening his mouth slightly, Bruno believed the young man, for some reason from his lips. It sounded like the truth. Standing up, they shook hands. They will definitely meet. There is no doubt about it. Driving in the car, I thought about Kira, because of this whole situation, he would not be able to get closer to De Pinos. As long as trusted people manage the construction, then everything is fine with the design. Viggen slowed down and a guy got into the front seat of the car. He waited for him for a long time. Having brought the plan closer to him, the guy said, turning to the boss. For some reason, he became interested in the design of the cafe. They were met by a young man. He laughed at the fact that he thought that his guests would be a little older. Kanye Jun invited them to sit down. He was the second son of the branch president and the grandson of the president of a prestigious university. He sat down on a chair, folded his arms and legs. He was interested in how they knew about his cafe. Weijin looked at him and revealed that he knew about the closing of the bakery. The guy continued to talk and smile. Everyone looked at him with different reactions, one skeptically, the other expectantly. Viggen continued that he liked these bakeries. He bought something there every time. He liked the bread. Kanye was happy, and the guy sitting next to him choked on his tea. The guy looked openly. You can ask him any questions and he will answer them. Kanye turned to the CEO and asked why the bakeries went bankrupt, narrowed his eyes and waited for an answer. A drop of sweat rolled down Viggen's cheek as he asked him directly. Kanye was waiting. He took the pose of a listener, turned to the guy so that they spoke without hesitation. The opponent is the president of a cool company. You need to choose your words carefully, thought the guy sitting with the boss. Good bakery with taste at a reasonable price. Put the mug on the table. Looking up at Kanye, the bakery was good, with an existing alternative. The company director's eyes narrowed, his eyebrows furrowed, and his whole face was serious. Folding his arms across his chest, Kanye said that this was off topic, that a company that has been doing this recently cannot discuss another company that has been doing business for a long time. The guy blew himself up. He apologized and asked Vagina to apologize too. If you give advice to someone who is bankrupt and has nothing left but debts, this means struggle. Kanye laughed out loud, throwing his head back. Such intensity in his words made him laugh. I leaned towards the guy, calmed down, and they began discussing the brand. Hardening takes a long time and is not a process that can be completed with a few blows of a hammer. Creating a clear image in the minds of consumers does not happen overnight. In order to attract clients, you need a positive experience, the young man said. Reliability, loyalty, comfort, you need to make consumers feel good. Kanye thought, in the restaurant business, the main thing is taste. They were guided by this. Viggen knew that it was not the same, either it was expensive or cheap. The man looked with a hard look. They didn't even think about the design. They had a model of the cafe in their hands, spread it out and showed it, pressing it with their hand. This is exactly what Cafe Fresco should look like, Viggen showed, jumping up from the sofa. Kanye brought the plan close to his eyes and began to read it, holding it with both hands. As a result, the man decided to ask his last question and looked at the guys. The question was, when is the cafe planned to launch, and it needs help in hardening? Viggen was pleased, but the interior is not all. There is still a lot of work to be done. Raising the plan, smiling, the guy said that they would be happy to help with this cafe. Kanye laughed loudly and openly. He extended his hand towards the guy. What the guy said is that his studio Vij does everything. He was confident in his work. The sun was shining. It was day. People were walking along the streets in loose clothes. Vika laughed loudly. She hugged the cold glass of coffee with both hands. Now she thought she could live. Vijin sat opposite her. He persuaded her to drink more slowly, while he himself smiled. She looked at him directly. A strand of her hair fell into her eyes. She was interested in how things were going. Folding his hands on the table, well, something happened. The guy looked to the side and answered, "Construction of the new cafe will begin next week." The girl folded her hands on the table, looked to the side, laughed. "There are a lot of cafes now." "The guy is very busy. Even the actors are not so busy. He will only have time in August." The other day she was invited to star in a show. She pressed her hands to her chest, and the guy clasped his hands. Vijin was confused. She didn't want to participate. This is not just a strange show. Vika raised the glass to her mouth. They sent her an invitation. The show is called Why Did You Come to My House? There you need to work as a team to decorate the house, she finished. The guy clenched his fist, shook it. He was sincerely happy for the girl. "You can even invite him to participate," Vijin laughed and showed his class. Vika pinched him on the cheek and screamed, which means that this is the only reason he wanted to see her. He was in pain. He put cold coffee to his cheek, and the girl thought how good he was. He had achieved so much. The girl admired him. He also had a good body and was tall. Vika was embarrassed. Her cheeks turned scarlet. She looked at the guy with wide-open eyes. "Reality shows these days are something out of the ordinary," Vijin said, raising his finger. "In general, he wants to be known as a designer," raised his glass, the guy said. Vika laughed. Vijin grew up, became like an old man. She pointed at him with her hand. She was interrupted by a man who came to the table and was angry. She did not answer the phone. Vika stood up, leaned her hands on the table. She joyfully greeted Frida and wanted to introduce her to someone. "Vijin, and he is perfect for them." The guy looked at those who approached. Frida was a girl with a thin figure and short hair, and a strong grip was visible in her eyes. The four of them sat at the table, talking. Vijin was actively telling something. His emotions were betrayed by his hands. Frida bit her finger. The story the guy told was interesting. They were ready to offer him to work with them. He understood the girl's doubts, so he pointed to the building under construction and offered to be there in 2 weeks and see everything together. She jumped up, liked the idea, and even decided to write it down. Vijin turned towards Vicky, winked at her, and showed his class below. I looked to the side where the construction would take place. Everything was going as planned. Vijin raised his hand to his mouth. Today he had to convey the final plan. Construction began, the fence was in place, but the gold print didn't like something. He was thinking, but he was interrupted by the man who was taking notes and looked at him. Something was wrong. Vijin laughed. Personal acquaintance with the site showed that something important was missed. He was puzzled that this was happening and what was wrong with the print. Vijin staggered. The guy was worried about him. He looked, maybe he should sit down. But the guy didn't hear anyone. He was immersed in his thoughts, wondering what was new there. People entered the building. Among them was the customer. He entered the cafe with long strides. People ran up to him and started talking, but he stopped them with a gesture of his hand. He walked further, stood near the doorframe, and looked at the guy who stood in a thoughtful pose. Everyone was worried about Vijin, but he didn't react to anyone. Everyone asked what he wanted, but the guy found what he was looking for. He clenched his fist, exclaiming joyfully. A man approached him. He asked if everything was fine, while the guy was silent. They couldn't find a place for themselves. The man asked if he had found what he was looking for, came up and pointed at everything around him. Vijin gathered everyone around him. They sat around a round table with a plan on it. The original plan was to use the ground floor for conceptual design. As you say, the design has to be the best, so they spent a lot of money on a huge coffee roasting machine, and the beans were from overseas. Instead of waiting for someone to guess, you will have a better chance of being noticed. Vijin raised his hands. The man folded his hands and thought he didn't understand how to take the guy's words. Putting his hand to his face, he saw the graphics on the plan and widened his eyes. Vijin laughed. He wasn't going to start construction without the chief's permission, so they needed to take a closer look. Having examined everything made of concrete from the walls to the ceiling, he looked at the guy for a long time. This is an early look at a design that will be popular a little later. Vijin folded his arms across his chest. The concrete style was not vintage at all, he concluded. Kanye nodded in agreement. It looked like a trendy cafe. He liked it. He looked at the guy's drawing, which he had drawn with a pencil in a free style. With careful finishing, the mess disappears. He wiped it with an eraser and it turned out to be a circle. He proved that it still retains the feel of an old-fashioned coffee shop, but overall looks clean and tidy. The young man looked at Vijin with respect. He said sensible things, but pointing his finger at the ceiling, he laughed. This is not because of saving money. Bowing his head, he shook. Of course not, he chuckled to himself. Raising his head, he told them the secret that such an open ceiling would be more expensive than closed ones. Vijin showed with his hand whether he had ever turned to a man or torn out the ceiling. He doesn't want to use raw material because it's not meant to look raw. The others were worried about how he would do it, but the guy assured that he just needed to work harder. Vijin finished, folded his arms over his chest, but it's beautiful and that says it all. Kanye laughed loudly, leaned back and continued laughing. People looked at him. The chief honestly admitted that he still does not understand this open design, but he understands the uniqueness and that the latecomers will be behind them. Ultimately, the man figured out the time. They promised 3 weeks, he asked, laughing. Everything will be ready by August, but the guy had one last request. The girl was hot. She walked up the stairs and was exhausted. She was tired of walking for so long. She clenched her fists. Very soon she would be sitting under the air conditioner. She calmed herself. Jaden greeted Helga. She was surprised and thought that he was also studying in the summer. He smiled. How can he study in such heat? He came for the book that Vijin asked for. The girl laughed. It was so similar to him. The guy was discouraged. Jaden pointed his finger at her, shouted, and accused her of not loving studying, but only dating. When the two walked inside, they tried not to look at each other. Helga stuck to the glass. She saw that there was filming going on there. The guy also looked shocked when he learned that there were reporters there. Without looking up from the glass, trying to figure out who was filming there, they were now both stuck to this glass. A handsome young man with a beard, stately and tall, actor Jen Org. Helga looked at Jaden. She was amazed that he pestered every beautiful girl. The builders were at the construction site of this building. They sat and stood in safety helmets. Tired, Vijin looked at the room. This design would have scored more points. The young man sitting next to him said that this time he is not trying, because he knows that at the last moment he will not like something. Taking the tool into his hands, it's sharp. He knows better. It's his design. The young man, seeing what Vijin had taken, asked why he drank. Turning to him, he was 3 days late because of him. He will fix everything. He took a saw and began to do the work, cutting off what was not needed, trying diligently. The men, watching him work, could not believe that he was so old. The guy came up after hearing the conversation. He said that he had been doing this for 20 years. The men whispered. They didn't believe it and wanted to know what the boss was thinking. But as soon as they looked at Vijin, everything was clear. A man with a camera in his hands captured moments, frames. He pressed the shutter. On the street among the trees, they were standing wet with sweat. The guy was pointing somewhere with his finger. Vijin only gave instructions to check the lighting in Sector 1, then to finish the first floor. The workers did their job, correcting, adjusting, correcting. On the right day, everything was ready. The entire area of the cafe was exactly as on the plan. The ceiling was empty. The man threw his head up and admired the ceiling. He didn't think that the open one would be so beautiful. Vijin had circles under his eyes, but he was happy to hear that his work was liked. He smiled, cupped his hands, thanked everyone, and dismissed everyone. But the men looked at each other. They were waiting for something with some doubt. They approached the captain and wanted to know what was wrong with him now. Vijin received a call. He answered the call, tilting his ear towards him. They had already arrived. Frida looked out the bus window. She waited for the moment when it stopped. The guy met her, smiling. He was glad that she had arrived. He looked at her. Having said hello, she looked out from under his shoulder. She was interested in the people who were sitting there. The guys were waiting for celebrities. Vijin slapped his forehead and grimaced at this. Frida, without looking up from her papers, said that Yulna Smart and Jen Org would arrive a little later, and Vika would arrive in her car. Raising her eyes to the young man, she clenched her teeth and pronounced a verdict that they would start with makeup. Vijin screamed, raised his hands to his head, that it would be natural, and he didn't need him at all. Frida pushed him in the back. She said that this was a necessity. Everything was ready for filming. Everything was in its place. People were milling about. The actors read their roles, repeated them, the girl and the man, and took it seriously. Vika was in a hurry. She left the car behind and ran to the shooting. Someone's voice called out to her. They were actors, and they greeted each other friendly. She saw something ahead, opened her mouth. Jen became curious and looked over his shoulder. The whole trio was shocked by the very cafe that Vijin built. They wanted to quickly go inside. Vika was worried. She wanted to know where the guy was, where he had gone. The girl finally saw him. Yulna exhaled behind her. Vika didn't even recognize him. A young man walked and adjusted the watch on his hand, wearing a white shirt. He looked amazing. 4 were sitting at a table in a new cafe. They were embarrassed by each other and felt uncomfortable. Yulna beamed. She put her palms cupped to her cheek. Her smile became wider when she found out how Vijin and Vika met. Vika laughed, put her hand to her mouth. She confirmed everything, and also added that they lived in the same area. She looked at the guy. The girl graduated from there. She also received counseling. Yulna and Jen cried out at the same time, investment advice. The man grabbed the guy by the shoulders, shook him, and tearfully began to beg him to help him in this matter. Vika laughed. She tried to intervene without removing the smile from her lips. Vijin stood and told what word the word vintage came from. Everyone stood and listened to him very carefully. It seemed they even held their breath. Raising the mug with the drink, the guy continued that vintage is fashionable for all time. Pouring coffee into their small glasses, the cafe is an architectural sophistication. Simultaneously raising their glasses and taking a sip, they tried the coffee in the new coffee shop. This coffee is different from the one Vika drank. A smile lit up her face. It has a pleasant aroma, Yulna agreed. She also liked this coffee. And Jen laughed and just asked for more. He closed his eyes and enjoyed this coffee. Several cameras filmed every word, every smile, every breath. Frila squeezed a piece of paper in her hand. Everything was removed. Everything was good and she liked it. Yulna was resting after the shooting. She thought it would all last longer. Vijin also exhaled. He would be on the show. He couldn't believe it. Vika leaned towards him and said that he did a good job. But turning to her, the guy replied that it was all thanks to them. The girl liked how Vijin looked today and he will quickly gain popularity. The young man was embarrassed, smiled, but considered it all nonsense. Jen also praised the guy, but he asked him to talk in person. Yulna tactlessly asked him about the girl. She could help. But Vijin said that first he wants to sort out the business and then start a family. This statement upset Vika, and she lowered her head. Jen couldn't stand it. He shouted about the apartment. He was only interested in that. The guy didn't know how much effect the show would have, but he thinks everything will be fine. The guy looked straight. He will continue to work. Everything should work out. Vijin was lying on the bed and eating chicken legs. Chicken on the weekend. What could be better? Looking at the leg, he remembered from the past that the chicken would be discontinued. The phone rang. He picked it up, looked up from the chicken. He first heard an apology about being disturbed on his day off. Putting down the leg, the character asked how the opening went and if everything was okay. That's why Kanye called him, a serious man holding the phone in his hand. Vijin cried out that something had happened. He felt something. Something had happened. The man's voice softened. He wanted to invite him to dinner today. There were many photos on social networks from actors from this place, from the cafe. Vijin was sitting at the table. In front of him was a plate of food and a glass of drink. The guy was embarrassed and flattered. He turned to the man about the fact that they had taken too expensive a dish. To this he objected, the cost of food is not important compared to his help to him. He brought a glass. They still have to work for a long time to be popular, as long as they get good advertising. The guy bowed his head. After all, he is a reasonable person, and thanked him for his trust. Kanye pointed to the dish. You need to eat quickly before it gets cold. Vijin brought a piece of meat on his fork. After tasting it, he thought that it was the best thing he had eaten. But in general, he called the guy here because he had a request. With their hands clasped, they are working on a strategy and therefore thought of Vijin as a reliable person. Space and branding are inseparable, so this is the way out. The man looked at him. Vijin raised a glass of wine to his lips. A long-term contract, which is what the guy wanted. Kanye wanted to know if the guy was willing to receive advice on a regular basis. The young man was surprised. He almost dropped the wine glass. He didn't even think about that. They asked to participate in the branding strategy. The man leaned back and looked straight. But Vijin needs him to tell him in more detail to lean forward. Kanye did some research and didn't see anything like this in industry contracts. Setting costs according to your interests, isn't that the beauty of capitalism? Showing his finger, the man wondered what Vijin thought about such an interaction. This is a win-win situation in which everyone gets something of their own. Now the guy has become serious and thinks about everything. Kanye finished by saying that he had prepared a gift for the guy. Vijin straightened up and stared at him. The center of the knowledge industry, September began. The building rose. The workers were moving all the things from one part to another. They were tired. Wijin pointed to the office and said to bring everything personal here. The director of the company is here. A man came in. The move would only take place in 4 months, but everyone was happy about it. Keanu walked by, the guys called him, calling him the leader of the group. He looked sideways at them. Wijin smiled and walked up to him to see if he liked being the leader of the group. He narrowed his eyes. The guy felt awkward and it was better to address him by his name. The young man held out a card in his direction. Today he will treat him to lunch. Wijin looked at Keanu, who was happy about the card and went to tell the others about it. Kanye and his team approached the guy and greeted the representative. Wijin thanked him for the wreath, but he thought that they were meeting tonight. The man smiled. He brought a TV as a gift, but if you need anything else, you just need to say. The guy smiled. That was enough, but the man insisted that in any case he could contact his secretary. They decided to hold the meeting now and gathered in the hall at a large round table. The man held the contract in his hands. If there are any misunderstandings on all sides, the contract will be terminated. But despite this, payment for all work already begun will be paid on time. He folded his hands and smiled. Kanye was pleased and agreed with the terms. Wijin held the agreement in his hands, raised his head, and smiled. He also agreed. In honor of the signing, he had another gift for the guy. The man asked to see the phone. Wijin took the phone in his hands, and in surprise, he opened his mouth and screamed. They increased the percentage of sales, thereby increasing the income received. Wijin held the phone and smiled. This is a very good bet. There will be a lot of profit. The man laughed, spreading his fingers. A great job done last time, but he was also interested in the output of the show. The show is due out next week. It's good publicity for the man. Kanye cried out after the guy couldn't see him next week. He got up from the table. Wijin scratched his head. He was embarrassed, but he needed to go to the university. The man pacified his angry outburst. The guy walked in the corridor of the building. The students looked at him and recognized him. He walked and heard people talking about him. Fame had come. Now it would be difficult to study. Suddenly, someone called out to him and put a hand on his shoulder. He turned to look. It was the professor. Wijin turned around and bowed his head in greeting. The professor was angry with the guy. Awards and television are not a reason to neglect his studies. The young man tried to justify his hard work week and moved to another office. The professor looked incredulously, as if the guy was making everything up. If only he could become a better person, help make the university better, then he would meet his old age in the sanatorium that Wijin built. The guy was confused. He could be free and go to classes that were about to start. The professor pushed him and sent him to study. He will follow the show. He thoughtfully put his hand to his face. He thought that he was a freshman and he should probably take it easy. A guy approached the professor. He already knew about the show, where he was filming with the actors. The man even boasted that he was also interviewed and that he might also appear there. Peter looked at the man. They want to put their name on Perestroika. The man raised the glass to his mouth and replied that everything was correct. It was the president of the Canon Company. The man understood what all this fuss was about, and if he only won, he could be invited there. Competitive applications are accepted in November. They looked at each other. The man walked away laughing and waved his hand goodbye. You need to try. He remembered about Wijin. If their Studio Vij takes part, it will change everything. Peter and the guy entered the office and looked around to see if they had come here correctly. The man smiled. He wanted to see how their boss kept himself in control. The door opened. A man appeared. He greeted the director. The guy was embarrassed and said that he had worked as a freelancer and had finally established himself. The CEO will be here soon while he goes downstairs. Peter couldn't wait to walk around and see the office. He wanted to know if all the money had been spent on decorating the office. Turning to him, the guy smiled, saying that there was not much space. Peter thought it was too spacious for all of you here, but Wijin's appearance and his words made the director look around. He didn't want to move several times. He stopped in front of Peter. The man was delighted with the guy, began to hug him and take an interest in his affairs. Wijin smiled and extended his hand. Of course, he knew from the very beginning that the number of people would increase. Taking the hand, Peter thought that this guy had intelligence and great abilities too. The guy looked at the guests. He was proud of his boss because he made such a good location. Having seated the director and his assistant on luxurious black sofas, he sat down in the chair at the head, ready to listen. Peter pushed something in a beautiful package with his hand, saying that it was a gift. Wijin began to unwrap the paper. He was wondering what kind of gift this was. When he finally tore the paper, he took out a sheet on which there was an inscription about the auction. He was very happy. He could not believe his eyes. It was a design competition. This is an apartment for reconstruction behind the bridge. Peter exclaimed how he knew so much, to which the hero replied that these places were popular. Vigin looked at Peter, who wants to hire a third-party designer to work on an apartment building. The hero pursed his lips. He was reading into this competition. There were changes in his past life. This is a good opportunity both for the sitting man and for the Vij company. The man lowered his head and admitted that the head trusted him and chose Vigin's company instead of the well-known one. Peter pursed his lips. He watched the guy and he didn't like the fact that he was silent. He's not sure. A barely noticeable smile flashed on the young man's lips when the internal competition ended. He was interested. Peter was pleased. He snapped his finger and talked for a month or two. Then he bit his fist. He couldn't do anything about it. He still had a lot of things to do. He clenched his fist. A sketch is enough for him. His own team will be brought in for the work. Vigin lowered his head and said without looking up that he would do it. Peter beamed with joy. He couldn't believe it and asked the guy several times. He couldn't refuse the gift, especially since it was a good opportunity for their company, even with outside help. The director was embarrassed. He began to tell the guy that he was always grateful and always for him. The men said goodbye. They smiled at each other, bowed and waved. Vigin sat down on a chair, threw his head back. He had so much to do. Reschedule the meeting, submit an application. The phone rang. He put it to his ear, and on the other end they asked about his business. The voice from the receiver continued that there was good news for him. Vigin listened carefully. Their first visit would be in October. The guy roared, "Why so early?" He didn't like it, but they said it was necessary. The guy put his hand to his face. He was tired, but they already need to book another photo shoot. The hero leaned back, exhausted. There were bruises under his eyes. Tears flowed from his eyes. The dates on the calendar were very close. There was not enough time for anything. He needs to study harder and needs to retake the class to avoid an academic warning. The cafe was very popular. These open ceilings beckoned you to look up. Frida and Vigin were talking in this cafe. He was interested in why the schedule was torn out like that. She visited the television director and he told her about the ratings of the newly launched program. Folding his hands and putting them to his lips, the director said that the rating was very low. She stood in front of the director and didn't know what to do with herself because he was angry. "We need to launch a new show." Frida leaned towards the boss, almost pushing him, "and she will do it. She needs to film as many episodes as possible. Now there are only 3, but there will be 5. Having shaken her hand, the director was very pleased with her. He did not imagine any other answer. Having heard the whole story from Frida, the guy became embarrassed and blushed. He closed his eyes. Vigin sat next to Vicky. He was sad. This semester is a failure, so they need a good show. Jen approached and told the guy that he had come early and was looking at him. Vika was indignant. She was also here and he didn't even notice her. The girl was offended. Patting Vigin on the cheek, Jen said that young people are so funny. The man began to suck up to the girl, saying that thanks to her, the filming went well. Vika looked back at the hero. They all know that it was she who brought him with her. Yulna arrived by car, jumped out, and immediately began to apologize for being stuck in a traffic jam. Jen began to reprimand her that she was unscrupulous. He raised his voice at the girl, but she was not offended by this. Vigin lost his face where filming begins, and this is such everyday life. The cameraman showed that filming had begun. The firecracker sounded, silence, and it began. The first shot was of Jen. He was showing his house. He wanted it to be decorated. Vika appeared and she began to praise the beautiful furniture. She had a desire to buy all of it. But the man snapped. Everyone was dumbfounded. He said that today it was his budget. Vika cried out that she could provide budgetary support. She was waiting for an answer whether it was possible. Lowering her eyes, Frida said that last week the group did not do well. Jen was just about to open his mouth. Vika covered it with her palm and asked him to be silent. If they play and manage to win, they will replenish their budget. Frida gave parting words. Everyone stared at her. They didn't understand what kind of game it was, what it was. She pointed her finger at the door and said that today was a team match with the person who was there. The door opened. The team froze at who they saw there. The two teams stood opposite each other. They wanted to greet everyone, but Jen was angry. He didn't want Dan to come here, who was already here and smiling. But some, on the contrary, were happy, so Yulna hugged the girl. In general, a cheerful team of opponents was selected. Among them was the rapper Odin. Vika laughed. She didn't understand what she needed to do. Even a blush appeared on her cheeks. Odin turned to Jen and was offended by his words about his bald head. Vijin didn't like the fact that the team he was part of was being bullied. He overshadowed the girl. One blushed, couldn't find anything to say. Jen was performing a dance behind him. Frida has settled the situation. They are here to decorate the room. She opened the envelope and there was a task to decorate the room. She was interested in the budget, so she turned to Viggen. The character calculated everything, calculated and named the amount for an apartment of a certain area. Frida smiled as they made a budget for each team. Jen screamed and raised his hand. This is what their producer is talking about. Continuing to smile, Frida nodded her head. Now she will need to vote for her team's favorite. You just need to make your choice. Red envelopes lay on the table in front of them. Turning to his opponent, he offered to make the first choice. The star architect, Leon Menace, stood nearby, but the hero has his own weapon, which he does not have. Vijin has this experience and knowledge. He extended his hand and selected his red envelope. Taking the sheet out of the envelope, the guy was sure that his experience was equivalent to Leon's knowledge. Decorative elements are also important. He had people who were for him. Jen raised his hand. He jumped up and said the answer, and the answer was fish sauce. Vika clasped her hands and slapped herself on the forehead because she had to name the decorative element. Vijin could not restrain himself and grunted into his fist. Yulna shamed him. Now is not the time to laugh. The opposing team answered correctly and received 2 million in their budget. They rejoiced. Jen was distressed. He always answered correctly. The girl thought that he ate too many seeds. He walked up to Weijin and put his arm around his shoulders. All hope was in him. They need a budget. The interior depends on it. Jen grabbed the guy by the chest and shook him. On the sheet was the following task. He read it carefully. You need to bring the material in a certain period of time. His team prayed for victory. They waited with their mouths open, scared for the guy. For this task, a whistle was heard. Frida and her assistant stood and watched the execution, and the teams rushed off. Vijin asked to find him an indoor tree with red leaves. Bringing his angry face closer to Jen's, he strained out the wood he needed. The girls were also here and were waiting for their orders on what they should do. They were tasked with finding Mobana, a valuable wood that was very expensive. The hero was in the office. He examined the furniture. It's difficult to estimate their value, but still. Mahogany and merbau are expensive even for 1 meter. He ran his finger along the tabletop. He raised his hand to his lips. He thought that these two colors would look harmonious. Wijin calculated that if everything went well, he would have the most expensive materials for free. Raising the board, the guy smiled and named the price of this one thing in his hands. Frida raised her hand and shouted that they had 10 minutes left. Vijin pushed back his chair and suggested that they drink coffee. They should relax and wait. His team members looked askance. It seemed to them that it was too early to relax. Vika looked at the boards and asked if he was sure of his choice. The guy was smiling from ear to ear. He was already sitting with a cup of coffee. You need to trust him. After taking a sip, they can wander around and find props that are also expensive. Vika doubtfully asked if she could really take something at that price. The young man agreed. The girl walked through the exhibition models. She was looking for a certain thing. When she found what she was looking for, her eyes opened and she leaned forward. Vijin stood with his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for his cruise boats. Leon looked at the guy and his pieces of wood. He wondered what he would do with this tree. Frida looked too. She couldn't believe her eyes. She hoped it was not in vain that they bought it. Vika, pleased with herself, carried something on her head. She shouted that there was another one. Frida turned pale. They are out of their minds. She thought how she should react to all this. They brought her a sheet. The results were written on this sheet. She accepted it. The opposing team was jubilant. They scored a decent amount and were confident of their victory. When the producer looked at the amount collected by Vijin's team, she was speechless. The hero was pleased with himself. He expected this. But what a surprise the others were. They were dumbfounded. Frida's face darkened. She bit her thumb. They had exceeded the limit and would receive a scolding. She turned to the guy who was looking at her that we needed to discuss this. But he hovered over Frida and asked if something was wrong, while the smile did not leave his face. The girl swore that they had done such a thing. Her hand touched her forehead and closed her eyes. He filled out the amounts with materials that he knew exactly how much they cost, as you can see the props. But Frida did not calm down without explaining what problems there were in this. She touched the wood, which is a small problem if you are forced to buy it to match the price. The guy looked at her. He will use her, so everything is fine. He will use it all, make something beautiful, stroke the boards. One thought they really want to win on a show that should make you laugh. Vika said that it looks like this is a win-win situation, she thought. Raising his hand, Vijin ordered not to worry. He will now show the technique. A few days later, there were boards lying around in the office, some intact, some missing. The guy's team came here. They looked around, saw their materials that they bought. Vijin laughed. He hung his coat on the hanger. Turning to them, he said that now they would not be able to return. They took everything seriously, got scared, stood like a pillar and watched. There were whispers and giggles. This was supposed to be an entertaining show. Frida laughed. They should create props for the house here and now. She was interested in Vijin's experience with woodworking and stared at him, waiting for an answer. Having named the number, there was a chuckle behind him. At 1 year old, as soon as he started walking, he immediately grabbed the hammer. Vika laughed at why he played with a hammer as a child. She didn't appreciate the humor. Vijin showed the board, the same one that was matched to the color. They will now make furniture. Frida clasped her hands. She prayed that everything would work out, that her show would go on. Hands in white gloves held a tree that was being cut by a saw. Jen whispered in the master's ear that there was still a lot of work to do, and when he received no answer, he grimaced. He was dissatisfied and had no desire to do anything with his own hands. Frida clenched her fist. In any case, even if she loses, she will win. But the guy was not distracted. He worked. He knew what he was doing. The confidence in his eyes did not fade. He smiled, embarrassed. He was in his element. He liked everything. Vika approached the hero from behind. She was interested in finding out what she could do, how she could help. Frida approached the man and wanted to know if it was possible to make furniture in a day. Despite the lack of faith in their team, the guys worked, carried boards, cut. The producer still believed that the show would be interesting. Vijin turned to Jen. They can try to cut it together. Vika stretched. She will go change clothes. It will be much better for work. Frida laughed. The cameras quickly clicked. They photographed the girl in her clothes. The guy called the girls over. Vijin wanted to show them something, so he needed to come up quickly. The hero began to show and tell how table corners are made. The guy smiled, showed, explained. He liked to plan and do it. All the work was in full swing. Everyone was busy with their own affairs. The room smelled deliciously of wood. Yulna approached the character. She was crying. She was holding fragments of the board in her hands. But Vijin praised everyone. His patience was enormous. He even showed Jinu his class. He smiled at Vika, who was also trying. The girl was embarrassed. Her cheeks turned red. Frida put her hand to her mouth. So good job, they're doing great. When they finally finished, everyone was happy. The guy even finished earlier than expected. Frida was pleased that everything worked out. She squinted and the smile did not leave her face. Beautiful tables, chairs, walls, everything smacked of novelty. They coped with this task when no one believed in them.